Victor Langford didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door of Wyatt Mercer's barn like he owned it, because in his mind, he already did. 3 of his hired men fanned out behind him, spurs dragging across the dirt floor, while Langford himself stopped in the center of the space and looked around with the slow, satisfied expression of a man taking inventory of something that was about to become his. Mercer. His voice carried no urgency, just that flat, quiet certainty that rich men use when they've already decided how things will end. I'm giving you 1 more week. After that, my lawyers file the survey correction, and this land reverts to county control. He smiled, barely, just enough to make it worse. You won't even get to say goodbye to it. He turned and walked out without waiting for a response, because in Victor Langford's world, there was no response worth hearing. If you've ever watched a good man get pushed to the edge of everything he had left, and then watched a stranger walk out of a stagecoach and change the entire equation, then this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Hit the like button, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay close, because what happens next is something none of them saw coming. Not Langford, not the town, and especially not Wyatt Mercer. The letter had taken Wyatt 3 nights to write, not because he was a poor writer. He'd had enough schooling for that, but because every time he got to the part where he had to describe what he was actually asking for, his hands stopped moving and he just sat there staring at the candle burning down on the table beside him. He was 41 years old. He had 230 acres of grazing land in the lower Colorado foothills, a decent herd that had survived 3 hard winters, a barn that needed new siding on the north wall, and a house that had been quiet for 4 years. He had calluses on both hands, a bad knee that ached when the weather changed, and a reputation among his neighbors as a man who kept his word and minded his business. What he didn't have was anybody to talk to at the end of the day. He'd buried his wife, Clara, in the spring of 1874. A fever that swept through the valley fast and cruel, the kind that didn't give a person time to prepare. Their son had been 6. The boy, Thomas, had gone to live with Clara's sister in Denver the following year because Wyatt had to be honest with himself. He could barely keep himself alive through those first winters alone, let alone raise a child properly. Thomas wrote letters sometimes. Wyatt wrote back. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough. The winters were the worst part, not the cold itself. He could manage cold. It was the silence that came with it. The way a house with no other person in it stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a place where you simply waited out time. His neighbor, Earl Putnam, had suggested the agency the previous spring. Earl was a big, straightforward man who delivered opinions like he delivered fence posts, planted firmly and without apology. You need a wife, Earl had said, leaning on the corral fence while Wyatt worked a young gelding. Not because of the ranch, because you're starting to look like a man who's forgotten what he's working for. Wyatt hadn't answered right away. He rarely did. But the letter existed now. 3 pages, careful and plain. He'd described the ranch honestly. The acreage, the cattle, the condition of the house, the isolation. He'd described himself the same way. Not young, not wealthy, not easy to live with, probably after 4 years of his own company. He wanted someone practical, someone who understood that frontier life was hard and didn't expect it to be otherwise. Someone who could manage a household, help with the books, maybe assist during calving season if she had the constitution for it. He wasn't looking for anything romantic. He'd had that once. He understood it couldn't be replaced. He'd sealed the envelope and written it to Glenbrook himself, dropped it with the postmaster, and spent the next 6 weeks trying not to think about it. The agency wrote back in early August. Her name was Evelyn Ashcroft. She was 34 years old, originally from Ohio, most recently from Kansas City. Her references were solid. She was described as capable, educated, and adaptable to frontier conditions. There was a photograph enclosed, small, slightly blurred the way photographs always were, showing a composed woman with dark hair and steady eyes who looked directly at the camera with an expression that gave away nothing particular. Wyatt studied the photograph for longer than he meant to. Then he wrote back and confirmed. She would arrive on the October stagecoach, Glenbrook, Tuesday afternoon. He told himself he wasn't nervous. He was wrong about that. The town of Glenbrook had roughly 300 residents, 2 saloons, a general store, a livery, a church, a doctor's office that doubled as a barbershop, and approximately no shortage of opinions about other people's business. By the time Wyatt's wagon rolled down the main street on that Tuesday afternoon in October, word had already spread that the Mercer widower was meeting his mail-order bride off the stage. Wyatt didn't know how word had spread because he'd told exactly nobody. But that was Glenbrook. Information moved through that town the way water moved through cracked ground, quietly, persistently, and inevitably everywhere. He tied up the team in front of the stage office and stood on the boardwalk with his hat in his hands, turning the brim in slow circles the way he always did when he was uncomfortable and trying not to show it. Earl Putnam had offered to come along for moral support. Wyatt had declined firmly. This was already awkward enough without an audience. I was wrong about that too. About a dozen people managed to find reasons to be in the vicinity of the stage office that afternoon. May Coffey from the dress shop, Old Harris who ran the feed store, Deputy Elkins, who at least had the grace to pretend he was there on official business, a cluster of women near the milliners who were doing very little shopping and a great deal of watching. Wyatt kept his eyes on the road and tried to look like a man with nowhere better to be. The stagecoach came in at 2:30, trailing a thin cloud of October dust. It rolled to a stop with the usual grinding protest of the brake, and the driver climbed down from the box and began unhooking bags from the rear boot while passengers started to emerge. An older couple, a heavy-set man in a wool coat who looked like a merchant, a young cowhand who dropped straight to the ground and immediately pulled out a cigarette, and then the last passenger stepped down, and Glenbrook went quiet. Not completely quiet. There was still the sound of the horses blowing and the driver working the baggage and a dog barking somewhere down the street. But the human noise dropped away. The conversations on the boardwalk stopped mid-sentence. May Coffey's mouth actually opened slightly. Wyatt Mercer stood very still. The woman who had just stepped off that stagecoach was not what he had prepared himself for. She was tall, taller than he'd expected, with dark hair pinned back under a practical traveling hat, and she moved with a kind of unhurried certainty that had nothing to do with arrogance. She was wearing a sensible wool coat, slightly road-dusty from travel, and she was carrying a leather satchel in one hand, and had a second bag that she'd already retrieved from the driver before anyone thought to help her. Her face, he could see it clearly now as she turned to look at the street, was the kind of face that made you look twice, not because it was decorated or put together for display, but because there was something direct about it, something that held its own. She was, by any measure, a strikingly beautiful woman. And she was scanning the boardwalk with calm, methodical eyes, clearly looking for someone, and clearly not in any particular distress about the fact that every person within sight was staring at her. Wyatt's first coherent thought was, the agency made a mistake. His second thought, which arrived immediately behind it, was, she's going to take one look at this town and get right back on that stage. He made himself walk forward. His knee ached in the cold. His hat was still in his hand, which suddenly felt wrong, and he wasn't sure whether to put it back on or keep holding it. She spotted him before he reached her. He watched her gaze land on him, measure him in about 2 seconds the way a practical person measures a situation. Not harshly, just accurately. And then she shifted her bag to her left hand and extended her right. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was clear and even. "I'm Evelyn Ashcroft. I hope I haven't kept you waiting long." He shook her hand. Her grip was firm. "Just arrived," he said. "Stage was on time." It was, actually. I was surprised. She glanced briefly at the people watching from the boardwalk, and something shifted in her expression. Not embarrassment, not irritation, just a quiet acknowledgement that she'd registered what was happening. Then she looked back at him. "Is there somewhere we can sit and talk before we head out, or would you prefer to start moving?" "There's a place down the block," he said. "Coffee, if you need a few minutes." Coffee would be good. She picked up her second bag before he could offer to take it. "I've been on that stage since Pueblo. My back would appreciate a chair that isn't moving." It was such a normal thing to say, tired from travel, wanting coffee, noting her back hurt, that Wyatt felt some of the braced tension in his chest loosen slightly, just slightly. He led her toward the cafe, acutely aware of every pair of eyes following them down the street. The cafe was warm and nearly empty at that hour. Just the owner, a stout woman named Bertha who pretended to be wiping down the counter while watching them with undisguised interest, and an old farmer at the far end nursing the same cup of coffee he'd probably been nursing for an hour. They sat across from each other at a table near the window. Bertha brought coffee without being asked, which told Wyatt she'd heard the same gossip everyone else had. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Wyatt turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. Same habit as with the hat brim, and tried to find the right place to start. There were things he'd intended to say, practical things he'd mentally rehearsed on the drive into town. None of them came forward now. Evelyn saved him the trouble. "I want to tell you something before we go any further," she said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "I know what I look like walking off of that stagecoach. I know that's not what you were expecting, and I know what people out there are already saying." She tilted her head slightly toward the window and the street beyond. "So, I'd rather we get ahead of it." Wyatt met her eyes. "All right. I'm not running from anything scandalous. I'm not fleeing a broken engagement in secret. I'm not what people will decide I am before they know me, and I'm not going to spend the next 6 months apologizing for being whatever they think I shouldn't be." She said it without heat, just flat and clear, the way a person states facts they're tired of having to state. "What I am is exactly what I wrote to the agency. A practical woman with useful skills who is looking for a practical arrangement on terms that make sense for both people involved." She paused. "Now, I've read your letter a number of times. You were honest about the ranch. I'd like you to be equally honest with me right now, sitting here. What is it you actually need?" Wyatt looked at her. He set down his coffee. "Someone who can manage the household without me having to manage them," he said. "Someone who won't fold up the first time things get hard. I need help with the books because I'm decent with cattle and poor with numbers. And company, I suppose." He stopped, feeling that last word sit there more nakedly than he'd intended. "I know what you mean," she said. Not dismissively, just acknowledging it. "The house is plain," he said. 4 rooms, good roof, wood stove that draws well. I don't have a lot to offer in terms of comfort." "Mr. Mercer." She looked at him steadily. "I spent 4 years helping my father treat patients in a frontier settlement in Kansas. I've delivered calves, set broken bones, and done accounting for a man who couldn't see straight. I'm not worried about the house." Wyatt studied her for a long moment. "You said delivered calves." "I said I've delivered calves. My father treated everything and everyone. I helped with whatever was needed." "Your father was a doctor." "Was. He died 2 years ago." She said it the way people say facts they've made peace with, not without feeling, but without needing anything from the other person about it. "That's partly why I'm here. The settlement I was in doesn't exist anymore. The community moved on. I needed somewhere new to be useful." Something about that phrase, "somewhere new to be useful," caught at Wyatt in a way he didn't fully understand. He recognized it, maybe, the practical framing of something that was actually much harder than it sounded. "My ranch has problems," he said, because it seemed suddenly important to be as honest as she was being. "Not just hard work. I have a neighbor, Victor Langford, who's been pushing at my borders for 2 years. Claims there's a survey discrepancy on the eastern edge of my property. I think it's manufactured. I haven't been able to prove it." Her expression sharpened slightly. "What kind of survey discrepancy?" "He says the county markers were placed wrong in 72. Says about 40 acres that I've been grazing are actually county land he has a pending claim on. My deed says otherwise, but his lawyers are better than anything I can afford." She was quiet for a moment, and he watched her think, not drift, but actually think, the way someone processes information they're filing carefully. "Do you have the original survey documents?" "I have copies. The originals are at the county office." "And the markers themselves? Are they still in the field?" "Far as I know." She nodded slowly. Something behind her eyes had shifted, focused. "We should look at those documents," she said. "Not urgently, but soon." Wyatt tilted his head. "You know something about land surveys?" "I know something about a pattern of behavior I've seen before." She didn't elaborate right away, just picked up her coffee cup. "Let's get out to the ranch. I'd rather see what we're actually dealing with before I say more." The drive out took the better part of an hour, following a road that got less road-like the further they went from town. Wyatt drove. Evelyn sat beside him on the wagon bench, her bags stowed in the bed behind them. The foothills rolled out ahead in the late afternoon light. The aspens already turned gold, and some of them past it, the higher ridgelines carrying the first thin trace of early snow. Neither of them talked constantly, which Wyatt noticed and appreciated. He'd been alone long enough that he'd developed strong opinions about unnecessary talking. Some people couldn't tolerate silence without filling it. Evelyn seemed comfortable with it. She did speak, though. She asked practical questions. The size of the herd, the layout of the grazing sections, where the water sources were, how he managed the books currently, when calving season ran. They weren't idle questions. She was building a picture. He could hear it in the way she listened to his answers. A brief pause after each one, like she was placing it somewhere. At one point, she asked, "How long since you had anyone helping out here full time?" 4 years, he said. Then, because the honesty seemed to be running in one direction already, since my wife died. She let that sit for exactly the right amount of time, not rushing past it, not making a production of it. "I'm sorry," she said simply, and moved to the next question. The ranch came into view as the road crested a low rise. The main house, the barn, the outbuildings, the corrals, everything laid out in the particular unadorned way that frontier working ranches looked. Nothing decorative, everything purposeful or meant to be. He watched her take it in. "The siding on the north barn wall needs replacing," she said. He blinked. "I know. It's on the list." "The water trough by the far corral. Is it level? It looks like it's tilted." He squinted toward where she was looking. "It's been losing water on the south end. It's the ground shifting. You probably need to reseat the posts underneath before it gets worse." She said it with the same tone she'd used to describe everything else, not showing off, just noting what she saw. "The mare in the near corral, she's favoring the left foreleg." Wyatt looked at the corral. Daisy, his older bay mare, was standing slightly off on that side. He'd noticed it that morning and made a mental note he hadn't gotten back to. "I was going to check her this evening. I can look at her when we get in," she paused. "If that's all right." "You know horses?" "My father made rounds by horseback for 11 years, she said. "I know horses." They pulled into the yard, and Wyatt set the brake and climbed down and tied the team. He came around to her side of the wagon, meaning to help her down. It seemed like the right thing to do, whatever the arrangement was. But she'd already stepped down on her own, her bag over her shoulder, and was walking toward the corral where Daisy stood. He watched her go straight to the horse, not approaching too fast, talking low, and put her hand on the mare's shoulder and work her way down to the leg with the slow, matter-of-fact confidence of someone who'd done this before. Daisy, who was not generally patient with strangers, stood still for it. "Stone bruise," Evelyn said, without looking up. "She needs a few days of light work. I can wrap it tonight and check again in the morning." Wyatt stood there for a moment. The agency made a mistake, he'd thought, watching her step off that stagecoach. I was starting to wonder if the mistake was actually his, the assumption that he understood what he'd asked for. The inside of the house was clean, but bare in the way that a man's house got bare when there was no one to push back against the drift toward pure function. A table, chairs, a cook stove, shelving with canned goods and staples, a stone fireplace that still worked well. The 2 back rooms, his bedroom and the second room that had been Thomas's, now empty and plain. He showed her the second room. "You'd have your own room," he said. "Privacy, whatever that arrangement looks like is. I don't expect anything that wasn't agreed to." She set her bag on the bed and looked at the room. "Thank you," she said. "That's decent of you." Not gushing, not cold, just acknowledging it as the practical, reasonable thing that it was. She asked where he kept the ranch records. He brought out the ledger and the box of documents he'd accumulated over the past several years. Receipts, correspondence, the survey paperwork, the deeds, the letters from Langford's lawyers. He set them on the table. She sat down and began looking through them with the focused efficiency of someone who read documents for the same reason he read land, to understand what was actually there. He started the fire and put water on for coffee and moved around the kitchen quietly, aware of her at the table the way you become aware of someone's presence when you've been too long without it. "Mr. Mercer." Her voice was level, but something in it made him set down the coffee tin and turn. "Wyatt," he said. "Please." "Wyatt." She was looking at a letter in her hand, and her expression had gone careful in a way it hadn't been before. "This letter from Langford's attorneys, the one about the survey correction." She looked up. "When did you receive this?" "August, maybe early September." "And this one?" She held up a second document. "That came in spring, April maybe." "And you said there were others before that?" "Going back about 2 years, like I said." She set both documents down flat on the table and looked at them side by side for a long moment. Then she looked up at him, and her eyes had the careful, controlled steadiness of someone who is choosing exactly how much to say before they understand more. "I need to see the county land office records," she said. "The survey originals, the water rights filing." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I think I know what he's doing, and if I'm right, it isn't just about your 40 acres. The fire crackled. Outside, the October wind moved through the aspens, and a horse shifted in the corral, and the silence of the ranch settled around the two of them like something tangible. "Tell me," he said. She folded her hands on the table. Not yet. I need to see the documents first. I don't want to tell you something alarming if I'm wrong about it. She paused. But I don't think I'm wrong. Wyatt pulled out a chair across from her and sat down. He looked at her, this woman he had known for the space of an afternoon, who had come off a stagecoach into a town full of whispers and walked straight past all of them, who had spotted a lame horse from a moving wagon and a leaking trough from 100 yards, who was now sitting at his kitchen table at the end of a very long day and reading his legal documents with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. "All right," he said. Outside, far down the valley road, the last light was going. And somewhere beyond the ridge to the east, though Wyatt had no way to know it yet, Victor Langford was eating a very good dinner in his very large house and telling himself that the Mercer situation would resolve itself before the first snow. He was wrong about that too. She didn't sleep well her first night on the ranch. Evelyn lay in the narrow bed in Thomas's old room and listened to the house settle around her. The particular language of an old structure in cold weather, the ticking of wood contracting, the low moan of wind finding gaps in the eaves. She'd slept in worse places. A settlement tent in Kansas with a hard freeze coming through the canvas. A boarding house in Wichita where the woman in the next room cried every night for 2 weeks. This was fine. The bed was clean, the blankets adequate, the room quiet enough once the wind dropped. It wasn't discomfort keeping her awake. It was the documents. She'd spent the last hour before turning in, sitting at Wyatt's kitchen table after he'd gone to bed, reading through everything in that box a second time, more slowly. The survey letters, the water rights correspondence, the county filings. She'd laid them out in chronological order and read them as a sequence rather than as isolated pieces, and by the time the candle burned down to a stub, she had a very clear picture of what she was looking at. She'd seen this before. Not here, not in Colorado, but the shape of it was identical. The same incremental approach, the same carefully worded legal language that sounded like administrative correction, but functioned as occupation. The same timing. Filings spaced far enough apart that no single one looked alarming, but together constituting a coordinated campaign to displace a landowner without ever appearing to do anything outright illegal. The man who had taught her to recognize this pattern was named Gerald Holt. She had almost married him. That was not something she intended to think about at length tonight. She turned onto her side and watched the darkness beyond the window. Just the faint outline of the corral fence and the darker mass of the barn beyond, and made herself focus on what was actionable. She needed the county records. She needed to see the original survey from 1872, the one Langford's lawyers claimed had been improperly placed. She needed to compare it against the stakes currently in the field, because if Langford's men had moved those stakes, which she suspected, there would be inconsistencies in the soil around the bases, in the weathering, in the age of the placement. She also needed to understand what Langford actually wanted, because 40 acres of rocky foothill grazing land wasn't enough justification for the level of legal effort she was reading in those letters. There was something else. There had to be. She fell asleep somewhere past midnight, still working it through. In the morning, she was up before Wyatt, which she hadn't planned but wasn't going to apologize for. She'd found the coffee in the pot and had it going by the time she heard him moving in the other room. She'd also found eggs in a reasonable pan and made use of both. He came into the kitchen, looking like a man who hadn't expected to come into a kitchen with coffee already made and food already happening. He stopped in the doorway for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." She set a cup on the table. "Sit down. I need to talk to you about what I read last night." He sat. She poured, then sat across from him with her own cup and got directly to it. "The survey dispute isn't about 40 acres, she said, or it isn't only about that." He waited. "The eastern edge Langford's claiming is where your creek runs, isn't it? The one that feeds your main water trough and the north pasture." Wyatt's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes." "So, if that 40 acres reverts to county control and Langford acquires the county claim, which is what he's positioned to do based on that April filing, he controls your water source." The tightening in Wyatt's jaw spread to his whole face. "He cuts my water, I can't graze the north pasture." "You can't graze it profitably," she said. "You'd have to haul water or sell off half the herd. Either way, the operation becomes marginal within one season." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "Then he makes you an offer on the land, probably a low one, and you take it because you don't have better options by then." Wyatt sat with that for a moment, a long moment. She watched him process it. Not the anger, which was there but controlled, but the specific, sick recognition of a man realizing he'd been outmaneuvered without knowing the game had started. "How long has this been in motion?" he said. "At least 2 years based on the documents you have, possibly longer. The early letters are very careful. They read like routine administrative correspondence. That's intentional. By the time the language starts getting specific about legal action, you're already in a defensive position. I should have gotten a lawyer 2 years ago. The letters were designed to make you think you didn't need one yet." She set down her cup. "That's part of the strategy. Each step looks minor until you see them all together." He was quiet again. Outside, one of the horses moved in the corral, hooves on the hard ground, and a crow called once and went silent. "You said you'd seen this before," he said. "Yes." "Where?" She'd known this question was coming. She'd decided last night how much to answer it. "I was engaged, years ago, to a man who practiced law in Ohio. He was good at it, particularly at acquiring land from farming families who didn't have the resources to fight properly in court." She said it evenly, not looking away. "I figured out what he was doing about 3 months before we were supposed to marry. I had access to his files because I helped him with correspondence sometimes. And I started noticing the same kind of patterns, small filings, carefully timed, always targeting the property's most critical resource. Water, in farm country, access roads sometimes, whatever was essential." She paused. "I confronted him. He told me I was misunderstanding what I was looking at." "Were you?" "No." Her voice was flat. "I ended the engagement. He spent the next year telling everyone who would listen that I was unstable and vindictive. I left Ohio." She picked up her coffee again. "I'm telling you this because you're going to hear a version of it from someone in this county at some point, and I'd rather you hear it from me first with the actual details intact." Wyatt looked at her. His expression was difficult to read. Not suspicious, not sympathetic in a pitying way, just careful and attentive in the manner of a man taking information seriously. "Did he face any consequences," he said, "for what he was doing to those farming families?" "Eventually. I reported what I'd found to the county before I left. Whether anyone acted on it seriously or not," she stopped. "I don't know. I wasn't there to see." "That bothers you?" It wasn't really a question. She considered how to answer it. "Yes," she said finally. "It does." He nodded, slowly, like he was filing that away. "All right," he said. "What do we do about Langford?" And something about the way he said, "we," not "what do I do," but "what do we do," as if her being here and having this knowledge made her automatically part of the response, did something unexpected to the space between her ribs. She ignored it with some effort and got back to the practical. "First, I need to see the county records. The originals, not copies. Can you get me into the county land office?" "I can take you in. Sheriff Aldridge knows me. He might be able to get us access." "The sheriff?" She looked up. "Is he reliable?" Wyatt thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. "He's cautious," he said. "He's not Langford's man, I don't think, but he's also not someone who moves fast without being sure of what he's doing." "That's not the worst thing," she said. "A cautious, honest man is more useful than a quick, corrupt one." She stood and went back to the stove. "Eat. Then let's go out and look at those eastern steaks before we ride to town. I want to see the ground." He ate. She found she was hungry herself. The eastern boundary of Wyatt's property was a 40-minute ride through grazing land and scrub oak, following the line of the creek as it wound toward the foothills. The morning was cold and clear, the sky that particular deep blue that Colorado got in October, and the creek ran low but steadily over its rocky bed, the sound of it carrying in the still air. The survey stakes were iron pins driven into the ground and marked with painted wooden posts weathered gray with age. There were 4 of them along the contested stretch, spaced roughly every 100 yards. Evelyn dismounted and crouched down at the first one without ceremony, examining the ground around the base. Wyatt stood back and watched her. She moved from stake to stake, crouching, probing the soil with a narrow tool she'd produced from her coat pocket, some kind of pointed instrument he thought might be a medical probe, repurposed. At the 3rd stake, she spent longer than at the others. Then she stood and looked back at him. "Come look at this," she said. He tied his horse and walked over. She pointed to the base of the post. "Look at the soil color," she said. "Right around the wood compared to 6 inches out." He looked. The soil immediately around the post was a slightly different color, darker, more disturbed looking, the texture broken where the surrounding ground was harder and more uniform. What does that mean? "This post was moved," she said. "Not recently. Maybe a year ago. Maybe more. But the soil around it hasn't fully settled back to match the surrounding ground. When you pull a stake and reset it even a foot or two in a different direction, you disturb the ground. Given enough time and rain, it mostly evens out, but not completely." She stood brushing dirt from her knee. "I'd want a surveyor to confirm it, but I know what recently disturbed ground looks like versus ground that's been undisturbed for 20 years. Wyatt stared at the post. A year ago. Langford's men could have moved these stakes in the night, any night, without him ever knowing. He didn't ride this boundary often enough in winter. The property was large enough that he couldn't watch all of it. If the stakes were moved, he said slowly, then the dispute over where the county line is manufactured, she finished. The stakes moved to match where Langford's lawyers claim the line should be. Then they file for a survey correction based on the current position of the stakes, which they've already adjusted. She looked at him. It's very clean. And it's very hard to prove without significant documentation, because the original stakes are gone, and the current ones have been in the ground long enough to look established. What do we need? The original 1872 survey field notes. Surveyors keep detailed measurements. Distances from fixed natural landmarks like rock outcroppings, specific trees, the creek bend. If the 1872 notes put the line at a different measurement from that creek bend than where this stake currently sits, we can demonstrate the discrepancy. She turned and looked at the creek. And I want to talk to whoever did the county survey in 1872, if he's still alive. Old Jonas Merritt, Wyatt said. He's still in the county, retired, lives about 12 miles south of Glenbrook. She looked at him. Would he talk to us? He doesn't like Langford, Wyatt said. That's about all I know about his opinions, but it's a start. Sheriff Clem Aldridge was a solid man in his mid-50s with a gray mustache and the careful, measuring eyes of someone who'd learned to be skeptical of urgency while remaining essentially decent. He'd known Wyatt Mercer for years in the way that men in small frontier counties knew each other, not intimately, but with accumulated respect from accumulated encounters. He received Wyatt and the woman with him in his office that Thursday morning with visible curiosity that he kept mostly under control. Wyatt introduced Evelyn plainly. She's been helping me go through the Langford correspondence. She has some legal knowledge. Aldridge looked at Evelyn. That's so. Some, she said, in a tone that was modest without being apologetic. They laid out what they had. Evelyn did most of the talking, which Aldridge clearly hadn't expected, and she could see him adjusting. Not rudely, just recalibrating. She was used to it. She kept her tone factual and her presentation ordered. The survey timeline, the pattern of filings, the condition of the eastern stakes, the creek access at the end of it all. When she finished, Aldridge sat back in his chair and looked at the documents she'd laid on his desk. That's a serious accusation, he said. Moving survey stakes is a criminal offense. Yes, she said. It is. And you're saying Langford's men did this. I'm saying the evidence suggests the stakes were relocated within the last year or two. I can't establish who moved them without more documentation. That's why I need access to the 1872 survey originals in the county land office. She held his gaze. I'm also saying that if Langford is doing this to Wyatt's property, he's probably not doing it only to Wyatt's property. This kind of scheme requires scale to be profitable. Aldridge looked at Wyatt. You know what she's suggesting here? I know, Wyatt said. If she's right, we're talking about a fraud case that's going to bring lawyers from Colorado Springs and probably from Denver. Aldridge rubbed the side of his jaw. Langford has friends at the county level. I know that too, Wyatt said. Aldridge looked back at Evelyn. And you want access to the county records. I want copies made of the 1872 survey notes before anything has the opportunity to disappear, she said carefully. I'm not asking you to accuse anyone. I'm asking you to document what's currently in those files while we can still establish what was there. A silence stretched out. Aldridge looked at the documents again. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at Evelyn with the focused, measuring quality of a man deciding whether someone is telling him the truth. You think Langford knows someone's been going through Mercer's documents? He said. I think Langford monitors most situations that affect his interests, she said. I don't know how much he knows about what I'm doing, but I'd rather move before he has the opportunity to manage the county records. Aldridge was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, took his hat off the peg, and said, Land office opens at 9. We can be there in 10 minutes. The county land office was a cramped, paper-stacked room behind the courthouse, managed by a nearsighted clerk named Purvis, who was manifestly unhappy about 3 people showing up wanting to look at survey records from 1872. He was even less happy when the sheriff mentioned it with the particular flat authority that sheriffs used when they wanted something to happen without making it an official order. The 1872 survey field notes were in a leather-bound ledger, filed with the original county plat records. Evelyn sat at the clerk's small work table with the ledger open and went through it with the focused attention she'd brought to everything else. Wyatt stood nearby. Aldridge leaned against the doorframe. Purvis hovered uselessly. She found the relevant entry in about 15 minutes. Survey party notes from September of 1872 establishing the eastern boundary line of what had then been recorded as the Caldwell Patent, the original land grant that Wyatt's deed derived from. The surveyor, Jonas Merritt, had recorded detailed measurements. Distances to a specific rock outcropping, distance to the creek bend, distance to a particular old cottonwood that had been marked with an X cut. She wrote the measurements down carefully in her notebook. "Can these records be officially copied?" she said, looking up at Purvis. He blinked at her. "There is a process for requesting—" "Sheriff," she said, without looking away from Purvis. "Copy the relevant pages," Aldridge said. "Today. I'll sign a receipt." Purvis's mouth opened, then closed. He went to find a copying ledger. Evelyn looked at Aldridge. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me if this actually turns out to be what you think it is." He paused. "And if it is, I need to know who else in this county might be affected before I take anything official to the county judge. I'll need a few days to go through the other property records," she said, "and I need to talk to Jonas Merritt." Aldridge nodded slowly. "He'll talk to you. Tell him Clem Aldridge says it's important." He looked at Wyatt. "You know what starts happening the minute Langford figures out someone's looking at those 1872 records." "He comes after the ranch harder," Wyatt said. "Or he tries a different angle." Aldridge straightened. "Watch your fences, Mercer. Both the literal ones and the other kind." They rode to Jonas Merritt's place the following morning. He was 73 years old, living in a small but carefully kept house with a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter and a workshop behind the house where he apparently still did woodworking to keep his hands busy. He came to the door before they'd fully tied the horses, which told Wyatt he'd heard them coming and been curious enough to watch from a window. He was a lean, white-haired man with the kind of eyes that had spent decades measuring distances across open ground, precise and steady. He looked at Wyatt, then at Evelyn, then back at Wyatt. "Mercer," he said, "haven't seen you since the Putnam's harvest supper. Who's this?" "My wife," Wyatt said, the word still new and slightly awkward in his mouth. "Evelyn. She's been helping me look into some trouble I've been having with Langford." Merritt's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did. "Come in then," he said. "Coffee's on." The kitchen was warm and small, and Jonas Merritt was not a man who wasted time once he understood the nature of a visit. He listened to what Evelyn had found in the land office records without interrupting. When she read him the measurements from his 1872 field notes, something shifted in his face, the look of a man recognizing his own careful work from decades ago and feeling it sharply relevant again. "That cottonwood's still there," he said when she finished. "The one you marked?" "Yes, I could take you to it." He looked at Wyatt. "And I can tell you exactly how far my eastern line is from that tree. I know my own measurements." "How does that compare to where the stakes currently stand?" Evelyn asked. He was quiet for a moment. His coffee cup sat untouched. "I haven't been out to look at those stakes," he said, "but I've heard the talk about the survey dispute, and I'll tell you this." He looked at her directly. "I don't make mistakes in my field measurements, not ones that would put a line 40 acres off from where I recorded it." "Would you be willing to go on record with that?" Evelyn said, "if it came to a legal proceeding?" Merritt looked at her for a long moment. "Young woman, I've been watching Victor Langford operate in this county for 15 years. I've watched him buy out ranchers who couldn't prove what was happening to them, and I've watched good families pack up and leave land they'd broken their backs for." He picked up his coffee finally, wrapping both hands around it. "You show me something worth putting my name on, and I'll put my name on it." Evelyn looked at Wyatt. He gave her a small nod. "Then we'd like you to come look at the stakes with us," she said, "and bring whatever surveying instruments you still have." They went out 3 days later, the 4 of them, Wyatt, Evelyn, Jonas Merritt, and the sheriff, who had decided his presence made it official in a way that was harder to later dismiss. Merritt brought his transit level and chain and his original field books, the leather gone dark with handling and age. The old cottonwood was there. The X cut, weathered but still visible if you knew to look for it, marked on the east-facing side of the trunk about 4 feet up. Merritt set up his instruments with the deliberate, unflappable care of a man who had done this for 50 years and wasn't about to rush it now. He took his measurement from the tree to where the survey line should fall based on his original 1872 notes. He marked the ground where the line should be. Then they all walked to where the current stakes stood. The distance between Merritt's mark and the nearest stake was 11 feet. Nobody spoke for a moment. The wind moved through the dry grass. The creek ran quietly below them. 11 feet, Aldridge said, his voice very level. 11 feet, Merritt confirmed. He looked at the stake. He crouched down and examined the ground around its base the same way Evelyn had, and after a moment he looked up at her. You were right about the soil. She wasn't happy about being right. She looked at Wyatt. He was standing very still, staring at the stake, and the expression on his face was the particular kind of fury that men carried quietly when they were trying to hold it in check because they understood that losing control of it would only make things harder. His hands were at his sides. His jaw was set. Wyatt, she said. He didn't look at her right away. Wyatt. Her voice was quiet but direct. He looked at her. We have it, she said. Right here. The measurement, the surveyor, the sheriff as witness. This is what we needed. He breathed out slowly. He moved the stakes on my land, he said. The words came out with a flat, controlled weight that was worse in some ways than anger would have been. He stood in my barn and told me I had a week, and the whole time he'd already moved the stakes. Yes, she said. He did. Aldridge was already writing in his notebook. Merritt was recording measurements. The documentation was happening right there in the cold October afternoon, which was the only thing she could offer him against what he was feeling. She knew it wasn't enough. She also knew it was what they had. What comes next? Wyatt said. We find out if he did this to anyone else, she said, and I already think we know the answer to that. She looked across the valley. The ranch rooftops barely visible at the distance, the creek winding through the dry grass, the land that Wyatt had worked alone for 4 years, that Clara had helped build before that Thomas might someday come back to if it still existed to come back to. I need to talk to the other ranchers in this valley, she said, every one of them who's had any kind of legal trouble with Langford. I need their documents and I need their boundary surveys. She paused. And I need them to trust me enough to show me. They don't know you, Wyatt said. I know. She looked at him. That's where you come in. He looked back at her. This woman who had arrived on a stagecoach 11 days ago and had since wrapped his horse's leg, fixed his accounting ledger, identified a fraud scheme he'd been living inside of for 2 years without seeing the shape of it, ridden to a retired surveyor in the cold, and was now standing in a field telling him she needed him to vouch for her to men who barely knew either of them. All right, he said. Then, after a pause, in a different tone, you're not what I expected. She almost smiled. Almost. No, she said. I don't imagine I am. Far down the valley road, a rider was moving at a pace that was unhurried but purposeful in the direction of the Langford property. Wyatt noticed him. So did Aldridge, who put his notebook away without comment. Someone had seen them out here. They both understood that, without saying it. Whatever came next was going to come faster than any of them had planned. The rider they'd seen moving toward the Langford property that afternoon was named Dale Cruz, and by the following morning, every decision Victor Langford made would be shaped by what Dale Cruz told him. Wyatt knew this without being told. He'd lived in this county long enough to understand how information moved when money was involved. Langford had people watching things the way a spider had threads, not directly, not visibly, but connected to everything that mattered. So they had maybe 2 days before the response came, maybe less. Evelyn understood this too. She was up before light the next morning, not because she'd slept well, she hadn't, but because there was no value in lying in the dark cataloging what she didn't know yet. She dressed and went to the kitchen and sat at the table with her notebook and the copies she'd made of the county records and started making a list of every rancher in the valley who'd had documented contact with Langford's lawyers in the past 3 years. She had 6 names by the time Wyatt came out. He looked at the list. He looked at her. You didn't sleep. I slept enough. She pushed the list across the table. How many of these men do you actually know well? He studied the names. Earl Putnam? Well. Tom Greer? Some. The Haverford brothers I know by sight mostly. Del Whitmore I've had trouble with in the past. Not serious, just boundary disagreements. Frank Osley I know through Earl. The boundary disagreements with Whitmore, she said. What were they about? Water, mostly. He's downstream from me on the South Creek. There were 2 dry summers where he thought I was taking more than my share. Wyatt set the list down. We resolved it. It wasn't much. Do you think he's reasonable? I think he's protective of what's his and not interested in anything that doesn't benefit him directly. He paused. Which is fair enough. That's actually who I need most, she said. A skeptic who's protecting his own interests. If I can convince Whitmore this affects him, he'll act on it for his own reasons, and that's more reliable than someone who's just trying to be helpful. Wyatt thought about it. Maybe. Start with Putnam, she said. Today, can you write to him this morning and ask him to come here? I can go myself. I'd rather you go and come back with him. I need you in the room when I talk to these men. She looked up at him. They don't know me. They know you. Your being there changes what they're willing to hear. He didn't argue with the logic. He finished his coffee and went to saddle up while she went to check on Daisy's leg, which was coming along but not ready for hard riding yet. Earl Putnam arrived mid-morning, riding alongside Wyatt with the comfortable ease of a man who'd made that particular stretch of road 100 times. He was broad-shouldered, somewhere around 50, with a red face weathered to leather and a handlebar mustache he'd apparently had since the war. He came into the kitchen, took off his hat, and looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of a man trying to reconcile what he'd heard in Glenbrook gossip with what he was actually seeing. Mrs. Mercer, he said. Mr. Putnam. She shook his hand. Sit down. I'll get straight to it. She laid the documents out the same way she had for the sheriff, but she read Putnam faster than she'd read Aldridge and adjusted her approach. Putnam wasn't cautious. He was instinctive. He'd respond to the concrete and the personal faster than the procedural. So she started with the stakes. 11 feet, she said. Jonas Merritt measured it himself, with the sheriff present. Langford's men moved the survey stakes on Wyatt's eastern boundary by 11 feet over the course of the last year or two. The purpose is to manufacture a legal dispute over 40 acres that gives Langford's lawyers a basis to claim the creek access. Putnam looked at Wyatt. He moved your markers? We have Merritt's measurement and Aldridge as witness, Wyatt said. Putnam sat back. His face had gone through 3 different expressions in about 5 seconds. That son of a... He caught himself, glanced at Evelyn, and adjusted. That's a criminal act. It is, she said. It's also not the first time he's done it, and I don't think your property has been untouched. She slid the list across. Has Langford's lawyers sent you anything in the past 2 years? Any kind of survey notice or boundary correspondence? Putnam looked at the list, then at her. Got a letter in June. Said there was a county road realignment being considered that would affect my north access. I thought it was just county business. Evelyn kept her expression neutral. Do you still have that letter? Somewhere. I'd like to see it. She paused. Mr. Putnam, I've seen this pattern work. When it's complete, you end up selling land you've held for years at a price you couldn't afford to refuse because your operation has been made marginal enough that holding on isn't viable. The creek access is Wyatt's vulnerability. Your north access road would be yours. Whatever Langford is targeting in each property is the thing you can't function without. The silence in the kitchen was a different quality than it had been before. Putnam was looking at the table, his large hands flat on the surface, and Wyatt could see him running through his own history of the past 2 years with new eyes. How many ranches do you think he's working at once? Putnam said. At minimum, the 6 on that list, she said. Possibly more. I can't tell without seeing each property's documents. She looked at him steadily. I need those ranchers in one room. All of them. I need their documents, and I need them to understand that this only works as a defense if they work together, because Langford can defeat any one of you individually. Putnam looked at Wyatt. She's right, you know. I know, Wyatt said. Whitmore won't come easy. I know that too, Wyatt said. Putnam tapped the table twice away with one finger, the way a man does when he's made a decision. I'll ride to Tom Greer this afternoon. He's a reasonable man. Between the 2 of us, we can probably get the others to at least listen. He stood and picked up his hat. Give me 2 days. Longford's first response came that same afternoon. Wyatt was in the barn repairing a section of stall divider when he heard the horses. He came out to find 3 of Langford's men in the yard. Not his top men, not the ones who carried real authority, but the second-tier ones who got sent for intimidation rather than negotiation. They sat their horses without dismounting, which was its own statement. The one in front had a flat, unremarkable face and small eyes that moved over things without settling. His name, Wyatt knew, was Cutter. He worked for Langford as a ranch hand in the technical sense, but that wasn't what he was for. Mr. Langford wanted to make sure you knew the legal deadline on that survey correction is still in effect, Cutter said. His voice was mild. That was the whole point of sending a man like this instead of a lawyer. The words were bureaucratic, but the delivery was something else entirely. 3 weeks from Friday, County Courthouse. Wyatt stood in the middle of his own yard and looked at the three of them. He was aware of the barn behind him and the house to his right, and the particular exposed feeling of having people on horseback in your space looking down at you. "I heard you the first time," he said. "Mr. Langford just wants to make sure there's no confusion." Cutter's eyes moved to the house. "Heard you've got a new wife settled in. That's nice. Hope she finds the county agreeable." It was so carefully phrased, nothing overtly threatening, just the fact of mentioning her in that tone, in that context. Wyatt's hands were loose at his sides. He kept them that way with some effort. "Tell Langford his deadline's noted," he said. "Now get off my land." Cutter smiled, barely. Then he turned his horse, and the three of them rode out at the same unhurried pace they'd arrived at. Wyatt stood in the yard after they'd gone and breathed for a moment. Evelyn came out of the house. She'd been at the window. He'd half known she would be. She stopped on the porch and looked at him. "How bad?" she said. "Not bad yet, just loud." He looked at her. "He knows you're here." "Of course he does." She came down the porch steps. Her voice was even. "Did they do anything? Touch anything?" "No, just a conversation." He paused. "They mentioned you." Something moved in her face, not fear. He was coming to understand that fear wasn't her first response to things. It was more like a calculation running, a rapid assessment of implications. "Putnam needs to move faster than 2 days," she said. "I'll ride to him in the morning." "Tonight," she said. "Please." He looked at her. The please was not something she used casually, he'd noticed. "Tonight," he agreed. Howe was back by 10, with Putnam's word that he'd have Tom Greer and Frank Osley at the Mercer Ranch by Thursday. Whitmore was still uncertain. The Haverford brothers, who were younger and less established, were reportedly scared enough that they might actually be easier to convince once they saw others moving. Evelyn had not been idle in his absence. He came in to find she'd begun drafting a comprehensive summary of what they had: the survey evidence, Merritt's testimony, the Aldridge witnessing, the pattern of Langford's legal filings across all 6 properties she'd been able to research so far. She was writing it out in the careful, organized prose of someone who had thought about how documents needed to read if they were going to matter. He set his hat on the hook and looked over her shoulder at the draft. "You write like a lawyer," he said. "I helped draft a lot of documents when I worked for my father," she said, not looking up. "Medical reports, county filings, insurance correspondence. You learn the structure after a while." She paused. "Sit down. I want to go over the Haverford property with you. Do you know what their eastern boundary runs against?" He sat. "Langford's grazing lease, the old Benson pasture." She looked up. "They share a boundary with Langford directly?" "About a mile of fence line." She was quiet for a moment, and he recognized the look. Something connecting, something settling into place that she hadn't had before. "Then they're not just being targeted for land," she said. "He wants to fold their property into his grazing lease. It's a consolidation, not just a water grab." She set down her pen. "Which means this is bigger than I thought." "How much bigger?" "I think Langford is trying to build a contiguous land holding across this entire valley. Not just water rights, not just access roads. He wants the whole stretch from the foothills to the county road, and each individual ranch is a piece of it." She looked at the map she'd sketched, rough but detailed enough to show the relationships between the properties. If he gets all 6 of these, plus his existing holdings, he controls roughly 80% of the valley's productive land. Wyatt stared at the map. "That's been his plan the whole time." "I think so. The individual tactics, the survey disputes, the road realignments, the water rights filings, they're each calibrated to the specific vulnerability of each property, but the underlying goal is the same for all of them." She tapped the map. "Which also means he cannot afford to let this stop with you. If your survey dispute gets resolved in your favor, it establishes a precedent that threatens every other piece of his plan." So his response to us isn't going to stay at sending Cutter around for a conversation. No, she said. It's not. The snow came 2 nights later. Not the killing kind, not yet. Just 3 inches of early season covering that turned the valley white and made the mornings brittle and cold and beautiful in the way that October snow in Colorado was beautiful when you weren't responsible for 30 head of cattle navigating icy ground. Wyatt was up at 4 to check on the herd. He came back in at 6 with cold in his coat and the particular tightness around his eyes that Evelyn was starting to recognize as his face when something was wrong, but he hadn't decided whether to say it yet. "What?" she said, pouring coffee. "North fence," he said. He sat down and wrapped his hands around the cup. "I need to ride out after breakfast." "How bad?" "Wires down on a 40-yard stretch. Could be the snow weight, could be the old post, could be something else." She looked at him. "How often does your wire go down on its own?" "It happens. Old fence line." He drank. "But not that stretch. I replaced those posts 2 summers ago." They rode out after breakfast, both of them in the sharp quiet of a snow-covered morning. The north pasture fence ran along the ridgeline where the property bordered a section of rocky public land, and 40 yards of it was indeed down. Wire pulled loose from the posts, not broken, not weighed down by snow accumulation, but pulled. 2 of the posts were knocked sideways. The ground around them was scuffed and disturbed under the snow. Evelyn crouched by the nearest post. There were boot prints, multiple sets coming from the public land side. "Last night," she said, "before the snow stopped, you can see the prints are partially filled." Wyatt was looking at the wire. It had been pulled loose from the staples deliberately. You could see where the staples had been pried rather than where the wire had failed at a weak point. Someone had done this by hand, systematically, working down the line. "The herd was in the south pasture last night," he said. "If they'd been up here—" "They weren't," she said. "He knows where your herd grazes. He'd have known that too." She stood. "This isn't about the cattle right now. This is about making you angry enough to do something aggressive and visible." He looked at her. "If you ride to the Langford property and confront anyone, you hand him a counter-accusation that muddies the legal water," she said. "If you go to Aldridge now, without the rancher meeting, without the coalition built, you're one man making a complaint against a more powerful man. That's exactly where he wants you." "I can't just leave my fence down." "Repair it. Document it first. I need to make drawings of the boot print patterns and the post damage. Then repair it." She was already pulling her notebook from her coat. "Every incident from here on gets documented. Every cut wire, every move marker, every conversation like the one with Cutter yesterday. Written, dated, witnessed, if possible." He watched her sketching the scene, the posts, the print patterns, the wire, with the quick, precise lines of someone who knew how to record a scene accurately. He felt a complicated thing watching her do it, not just gratitude, something that was harder to name and easier to set aside for now. "Earl Putnam's coming Thursday," he said. "Good." She didn't look up from the sketch. "Because I think we're going to find that his fence has had some trouble too." She was right about that. She was getting to be right about a lot of things, which should have been comforting and instead just underlined how serious everything had gotten. Thursday brought Putnam, Greer, and Osley to the Mercer Ranch, arriving within an hour of each other and filling the small kitchen to capacity. Del Whitmore did not come. The Haverford brothers, 2 young men in their late 20s named Cal and Reed, showed up at the last minute and stood near the door like they might need to leave quickly, which was all right. Standing near the door and being present was still being present. Evelyn had rearranged the kitchen table so the map was at the center, surrounded by the documented evidence. She'd made coffee. She'd prepared. She'd also thought carefully about how to begin, because this was the moment that mattered. These were men who'd grown up in a world where women organized households and men made decisions about land. She wasn't going to fight that directly. Fighting it directly would lose her the room before she'd said anything useful. So she started with Wyatt. "I asked Wyatt if he'd start," she said, "because you know him and because what happened on this property is the same thing that's been happening on yours." Wyatt told it plainly. The survey dispute, Merritt's measurement, the 11-foot discrepancy, the wire down on the north fence. He was not a naturally expressive man, but he was direct and specific, which was better. The room listened. Then she took over. She walked them through the map, each property, each documented point of contact with Langford's lawyers or agents. The pattern that emerged when you put them side by side. The road issue with Putnam. The grazing lease boundary with the Haverfords. The water permit filing that affected Greer's south pasture access. Tom Greer was a thin, sharp-faced man about Wyatt's age who'd been listening with his arms folded and his expression unreadable. When she finished, he said, "All right, Say you're correct about the pattern. What do you want us to do about it? 3 things, she said. First, bring me your boundary documents and any legal correspondence from the past 3 years. I need to build a complete record of what he's done across every property in this room. Second, I need written statements from each of you about specific incidents, fence damage, trespassing, anything concrete that happened on your land, dated and signed. She looked around the room. Third, I need you to stay together. Any man who deals separately with Langford from here on weakens everything the others are building. That's asking us to trust each other, Cal Haverford said. He was the older of the 2 brothers, dark-haired, with the look of someone who didn't sleep enough. Some of us have had boundary disagreements with our own neighbors. I know, she said. That's partly why Langford's been able to work on each of you separately. He benefits from whatever friction exists between you. She looked at Cal directly. I'm not asking you to like each other. I'm asking you to recognize that you have a common problem that requires a common response. Osley, who was a compact, weathered man in his 60s who hadn't said anything yet, said, What about Aldridge? Where does the sheriff stand in this? Aldridge witnessed the survey measurement with Merritt, Wyatt said. He's cautious. He won't move without solid documentation. But he's not Langford's man. He's also not going to act unless we give him enough that he doesn't have a choice, Evelyn added, which is what we're building. And if Langford moves against one of us before we're ready, Greer said, then we all respond together, she said, not with violence, with documentation and with witnesses. Every incident reported to Aldridge. Every legal filing answered with counter documentation. She paused. I want to be clear about one thing. The moment anyone in this room does something that Langford can frame as aggressive or illegal, it damages everything. He is waiting for that. Cutter came to this property last week specifically to provoke a reaction. Don't give him one. The room was quiet. Outside, the snow had mostly melted off the roof but clung in the shadows where the sun didn't reach, and the horses at the rail were stamping against the cold. Putnam spoke first. I'll bring my documents Monday. Greer unfolded his arms. I'll do the same. Osley nodded once, which seemed to be his version of a speech. Cal Haverford looked at his brother Reed, who shrugged in a way that meant yes. Monday, Cal said. Evelyn looked at the map on the table and felt something she was careful not to mistake for relief, because this was the beginning of something, not the end of anything. The night after the ranchers left, Wyatt came in from checking the herd later than usual, and when he came through the door, Evelyn was still at the table, working through the Haverford boundary documents that Cal had left behind. He'd had them in his saddlebag, as it turned out. Wyatt hung up his coat and stood for a moment watching her work. You should sleep, he said. I know. She didn't stop writing. Sit down for a minute. He sat. He was tired in the way that outdoor work in cold weather made a person tired, the deep physical kind that sat in the shoulders and the legs. He stretched his bad knee under the table and looked at the documents spread across the surface. The Haverford brothers, she said, their east boundary marker. It's in the same condition as yours, same soil disturbance pattern. I'd need Merritt to confirm, but I'm confident. So he's moved stakes on at least 2 properties. At least. I won't know about the others until I see their documents. She set down her pen and looked at him. There was something in her face that she was deciding whether to say. He waited. The man Langford's going to send next won't be Cutter, she said. He's going to try something that makes us look unreliable before the information we have can matter. What do you mean? He's going to find something about me to use. She said it with the same flat steadiness she used for everything difficult. He has people who know how to find things, and there are things to find, from Ohio. The broken engagement, the fact that I left under circumstances that Gerald Holt spent considerable effort making look suspicious. She folded her hands on the table. I want to tell you more about it now, before he tells his version to someone who tells you. Wyatt looked at her. The fire in the kitchen hearth had burned down to coals and the room was warm but dimming, and he had the feeling he sometimes got in conversations with her that he was being treated as someone capable of handling the truth, which was not how everyone had always treated him. All right, he said. Gerald Holt was very good at what he did, she said. He was charming, patient, and completely certain that the rules that applied to other people didn't apply to him. I didn't see that for almost 2 years. I thought I was in love with him. She stopped, and the stop was brief, but real. A pause that wasn't comfortable for her, and she wasn't going to pretend it was. When I understood what his legal work actually was, what those families were losing, I went through his files properly, not casually, thoroughly. She looked at Wyatt. He told everyone afterward that I'd stolen documents, that I'd been working with a rival firm, that I'd done what I did out of jealousy and personal bitterness. Her voice was even but taut underneath, the way a rope is taut. None of it was true, but truth isn't the only thing that matters when a man like that decides to ruin your name. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Did anyone believe him? Some people, the ones who found it easier to believe than to investigate. She looked at her hands. The ones who knew me well believed me, but the ones who knew me well were also the people Gerald had the least power to convince, so it was a manageable trade-off for him. And you think Langford will find him? Or someone like him? Gerald made noise for a while after I left. If Langford has people looking into my past, and I think he does, they'll find that noise. They'll bring it here and present it in a way that makes the ranchers doubt me. She looked up. I wanted you to know first, all of it, because if they do bring it here, what you say when they do matters. The fire crackled once and settled. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had come off a stage 11 days ago, carrying a leather satchel and a wariness so thoroughly managed it barely showed, who had read his documents and seen his land and identified in a matter of days what 2 years of living inside it had not shown him, who was sitting at his kitchen table at the end of a hard week telling him the most painful chapter of her life because she thought he deserved to know it before someone else weaponized it. He's not going to come at us from the east anymore, Wyatt said. We've closed that off. No, she agreed. So he comes at us from you. Yes. Then we make sure it doesn't work. He said it simply, the way he said most things. Not a declaration, just a statement of what was going to happen. She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes. Surprise maybe, or something quieter than surprise. It's not that simple, she said. I know it's not. He stood, his knees stiff. I'm going to sleep. You should too. We have a lot to do in the morning. He said goodnight and went to his room. Evelyn sat at the table for a while longer, listening to the ranch settle into its night sounds, the horses in the barn, the wind coming off the ridge, the particular silence of land that was being fought for without knowing it. She thought about the rider they'd seen heading for Langford's property after the survey measurement. She thought about cut fence wire and boot prints in snow and a man named Cutter with small watching eyes. Then she closed her notebook, put out the lamp, and went to bed. She slept 4 hours. It was, under the circumstances, enough. Langford moved faster than she'd expected. She'd thought they had a week, maybe 2, before he found enough about her Ohio history to make it useful. She'd underestimated how long his reach was, or how much he'd already known before she arrived. Looking back afterward, she suspected he'd had someone looking into her background from the moment Wyatt started pushing back on the survey dispute, which meant the file on Evelyn Ashcroft had been building for weeks before she ever stepped off that stagecoach. The first sign came on a Tuesday, 8 days after the rancher meeting. May Coffee from the dress shop stopped Wyatt on the street in Glenbrook when he came in for supplies and told him, with the particular nervous energy of a woman who wasn't sure if she was doing the right thing but couldn't help herself, that she'd heard something troubling from a woman whose husband worked at the county clerk's office. Wyatt came home that afternoon and told Evelyn. What exactly did she say? Evelyn asked. That there's a rumor going around the county seat that you were involved in some kind of document theft in Ohio, that a lawyer there filed a complaint and there are court records. He set the supply crate on the counter and turned to look at her. I told her it wasn't true. She said she hoped not. Evelyn was quiet for exactly the time it took her to be sure her voice would come out steady. It was faster than I thought, she said. You knew this was coming. I told you it was coming. She sat down. He's moved to the county seat level, which means he's talked to someone there. Probably whoever manages the land records. She looked at Wyatt. Aldridge needs to know. Today. I'll ride back in. We'll both go. Aldridge listened to what Wyatt told him with the careful, neutral expression that good lawmen developed for receiving information they needed to think about before reacting to. When Wyatt finished, the sheriff looked at Evelyn. You know about this court record? He said. There is no court record, she said. Gerald Holt filed a complaint with the county solicitor in Franklin County, Ohio, in 1875. The complaint was reviewed and not pursued because there was no actionable evidence, because I hadn't stolen anything. She held his gaze. What exists is the record of a complaint filed and dismissed. Langford, or whoever he's hired, has found the filing and is presenting it without the dismissal. Can you prove the dismissal? I can write to the Franklin County Solicitor's office and request the complete record. It will take 3 weeks minimum for a response. She paused. Which is time Langford will use. Aldridge rubbed the side of his jaw. What do you need from me right now? I need you to understand what's happening before it gets presented to you officially, she said, because it will be presented to you officially. Someone will come to you with that partial record and suggest that the woman helping build a case against Victor Langford has a history of document manipulation. And I need you to already know the context when that happens. He looked at her for a long moment. You're asking me to make up my mind before I hear the other side. I'm asking you not to be ambushed by half a story, she said, which is different. The distinction sat in the room for a moment. Aldridge turned his pencil end over end on the desk. Twice. 3 times. All right, he said, but I want you to write to Franklin County today, and I want copies of whatever comes back. You'll have them, she said. They were halfway to the door when Aldridge said, There's something else. His voice had shifted slightly, not softer but more careful. Del Whitmore came to see me yesterday. He didn't come to your meeting Thursday, but he had things to say about Langford. Evelyn turned. What kind of things? The kind that would help your case considerably, Aldridge said. He's had fence trouble, same as Mercer, and he's been sitting on a letter from 2 years ago that reads a lot like what you described, a survey notice that targets his water access. He looked at them both. He's not ready to join your coalition, but he's talking. That's different from where he was last week. Why is he talking now? Wyatt said. Because last month, Langford's lawyers filed a county road easement claim across the southwest corner of Whitmore's property. Aldridge folded his hands on the desk, right through the middle of his best grazing section. He came in here spitting fire. Evelyn felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a pattern confirming itself. Can we talk to him? He said he'd think about it. Aldridge stood. Give him a few days. He's a proud man and he doesn't like asking for help, but he's smart enough to know when he's outgunned alone. The letter came from Glenbrook's postmaster 4 days after she sent the Franklin County request. Not a reply, which was too fast, but a different envelope entirely. It was postmarked Denver. The return address was a law office she didn't recognize. She opened it at the kitchen table with Wyatt across from her. It was 2 pages. The first page was a letter from a Denver attorney named Cassius Prewitt, written in the formal but careful language of a man who had chosen his words specifically. He introduced himself as representing several parties with interests in land holdings in the southern Colorado counties. He had become aware of certain documentation efforts being made in Garnet Valley. He wished to advise that these efforts, if pursued through improper channels, could constitute interference with legitimate county proceedings. The second page was a copy of the Franklin County complaint. Gerald Holt's name was at the bottom. Evelyn read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the wall above the fireplace for a moment. Prewitt, Wyatt said, reading over the letter. I don't know that name. I do, she said. Not personally, but his firm has a reputation. He handles cases for mining and land interests across 3 territories. She looked at Wyatt. Langford hired real help. What does this letter actually do? Legally? Nothing yet. It's a warning. She tapped the second page. But the purpose of sending the Holt complaint with it is to establish, on paper, that I am a person with a history of document interference. If anything I've gathered is later challenged as having been improperly obtained, he has this letter to point to. She looked at Wyatt. He's not trying to stop us in the field anymore. He's trying to build a legal argument that discredits everything we've collected. Wyatt was reading the letter again, slowly. When he looked up, his face had the flat, controlled quality she'd learned to read as something close to the edge of his patience. We need our own lawyer. Yes, she said. We do. I can't afford what Prewitt costs. We don't need Prewitt, she said. We need someone who knows land law in Colorado and who isn't connected to Langford's interests. She'd been thinking about this since before the letter arrived, honestly. Aldridge mentioned a name last week, a lawyer in Colorado Springs, someone he'd dealt with on a water rights case 2 years ago. Do you remember the name? Arthur Vane. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. I've heard of him. He took on the Millhaven timber case. Won it. He's the kind of lawyer who takes cases he thinks matter, she said, which might work in our favor because we can't outspend Prewitt, but we might be able to interest Vane in what we have. She picked up the letter and its enclosure. I'm going to write to him today. I'll send him a summary of what we've documented and let him decide if it's worth his attention. And if he's not interested? She looked at Wyatt. Then we figure out the next option. She paused. I want you to take the original copies of everything we have. the merit measurement, the Aldridge witness statement, the survey records, the rancher documents, and put them somewhere that isn't this house. He frowned. Why? Because if Langford's next move is to claim I obtained documents improperly and someone with a badge comes here to look around, I want the originals to already be somewhere else. She said it without drama. Earl Putnam's house, or Aldridge's office. Somewhere with a clear chain of custody that doesn't run through me. He understood. She could see it in his face. The particular grim recognition of someone who'd never had to think about these things before and was now living inside them. I'll ride to Aldridge this afternoon, he said. Thank you. He stood and was halfway to the door when she said, Wyatt. He stopped. She looked at the letter in her hand. I know this is getting more complicated than you intended when you wrote to the agency. He turned and looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. I wrote to the agency because I needed help, he said. I got it. Then he went to saddle up, leaving her with that, which was, she found, enough. Del Whitmore came on a Thursday, unannounced, riding into the yard at mid-morning while Wyatt was mending the north gate and Evelyn was in the barn, working on the quarterly accounts she'd taken over from Wyatt's chaotic receipts box. She heard hooves and came out to find a rangy, sun-darkened man in his mid-50s dismounting in the yard with the deliberate movements of someone who'd made a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Wyatt came over from the gate. Del. Mercer. Whitmore looked at Evelyn. His expression was difficult to classify, not hostile, not warm. Something more like a man looking at a situation he'd already assessed twice and was assessing again. You're the wife. Evelyn Mercer, she said, and shook his hand. He looked at Wyatt. You got time to talk? Come inside, Wyatt said. They sat at the kitchen table, same positions more or less as every important conversation in that house seemed to happen. And Whitmore put a folded envelope in front of him and didn't touch it. 2 years ago, he said, without preamble, I got a letter from Langford's lawyers about a survey correction on my southeast boundary. I threw it away. I thought it was nonsense. He stopped. 6 months later, I got another one. I wrote back and said the matter wasn't in dispute and I wasn't interested in correspondence about it. Another stop. Then last month, the county road easement went through on my southwest grazing section. He looked at Evelyn. I've been here 23 years. Bought this land in 55. I know every rock on it. I know, she said. I'm not a man who asks for help. I know that too. He pushed the envelope across the table. That's every legal letter I've received from Langford's people in the past 2 years. And a letter I got last week from a Denver law firm. Prewitt, Evelyn said. Whitmore stopped. You got one too. Same letter, more or less, she said. Different recipient. He sat back. Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, but the adjustment of a man who'd been expecting to have to argue and was finding it unnecessary. He sent the same letter to multiple ranchers? I think so, she said. He's trying to discourage people from cooperating with what we're building. She looked at the envelope. Mr. Whitmore, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Have any of Langford's people approached you directly, not through lawyers, in person? Whitmore was quiet for a moment, long enough that she knew the answer before he gave it. A man came to my property about 3 weeks ago, he said. Said he worked for a county development company, offered me a price for the whole operation. He folded his hands on the table. Not an insult of a price, a real number. What did you say? I said no. He looked at her. But it was a serious offer, serious enough that I thought about it more than I wanted to. He paused. That's part of why I didn't come to your meeting. I was still thinking. Evelyn nodded. And now? Now the easement claim went through on my grazing section, and I have a letter from a Denver lawyer I never contacted telling me what I can and can't do with my own documents. He looked at Wyatt. So I stopped thinking. Wyatt almost smiled. It wasn't quite there, but it was close. Monday, Evelyn said, I'm going to have everyone together again. I'd like you to bring those documents, and I'd like you to hear what we've built since the last meeting. Whitmore nodded once, with the compressed decisiveness of a man who made up his mind rarely, but completely. Monday, he said. Arthur Vane's reply came 10 days after she wrote to him. Not a dismissal, not a request for more information. A letter that was 2 paragraphs long and said, in the direct and somewhat aggressive prose of a man who didn't use 3 words where one would do, that what she'd described warranted serious attention, and he would be in Glenbrook the following Friday if they were available to meet. She read the letter twice. Then she read it a third time to make sure she hadn't imagined it. Wyatt was in the yard when she went outside. Vane is coming Friday, she said. He stopped what he was doing. To Glenbrook? Friday. She held up the letter. He took it and read it. When he looked up, there was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not hope exactly, because he was too careful for something that clean, but the first suggestion of it. The way a person looks when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time and they see, for the first time, a possible place to set it down. That's good, he said. Yes, she said. It is. Vane was not what Wyatt had pictured. He'd expected someone who looked like money. Well-cut suit, polished boots, the easy self-possession of a man who moved through courtrooms like he owned them. The man who stepped off the Friday stage was in his early 50s, medium height, wearing a coat that had been good quality once and was now just serviceable, carrying a battered briefcase that had clearly crossed a lot of territory. He had sharp gray eyes and a face that had done a lot of thinking in cold weather. He shook hands with both of them outside the stage office without ceremony and said, I read what you sent me. I want to see the survey measurement documentation first. Then the property records. We'll talk about the legal situation after I've seen what you actually have. They took him to Aldridge's office where the originals had been stored. Aldridge was present, which Evelyn had arranged deliberately. She wanted Vane and the sheriff in the same room from the beginning, establishing that relationship before any of it became adversarial. Vane went through the documents the way Evelyn had gone through them the first night, methodically, silently, without commentary until he was finished. Merritt's survey notes, the measurement comparison, the Aldridge witness statement, the pattern of filings across 6 properties, the Prewitt letter with the Holt complaint attached, the rancher statements she'd collected. When he finished, he looked up at Aldridge first. You witnessed the Merritt measurement personally, he said. I did, Aldridge said. And you're prepared to testify to that in a county proceeding? If it comes to that, Vane looked at Evelyn. Prewitt's firm is not small. You understand what this turns into if it goes to a full legal proceeding. I understand what it turns into if it doesn't, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the focused, appraising quality of a man deciding what he's actually dealing with. Then he said, Tell me about Gerald Holt. She told him. All of it. The same way she'd told Wyatt, the engagement, the files, the complaint, the dismissal, the way the noise had followed her. She didn't editorialize. She kept it factual and chronological and let him draw his own conclusions. When she finished, he said, The Franklin County dismissal. When are you expecting a response to your records request? Another week, maybe 10 days. I'll write to them separately. My request may move faster. He made a note. The Holt complaint that Prewitt attached to his letter, presenting a dismissed complaint without disclosing the dismissal, is an ethical violation. It's minor in the context of everything else, but it's something. He closed the folder. Here's what I'll tell you about where this stands. You have a strong evidentiary foundation. The survey fraud is real and demonstrable. The pattern across multiple properties constitutes organized fraud at a level that interests federal land office jurisdiction, not just county jurisdiction. He looked at Wyatt, which means if we file this properly, it doesn't stay in Langford's county where his relationships matter most. Wyatt glanced at Evelyn. She was watching Vane with the careful attention of someone hearing their own analysis confirmed by someone with the authority to confirm it. What do you need from us? Wyatt said. A few things. Vane folded his hands on the desk. First, all 6 ranchers need to provide formal sworn statements. What they've given you so far is good for building the case, but it needs to be sworn and witnessed to be useful in a proceeding. Second, I need Merritt on record formally. Not just a witness measurement, but a sworn professional affidavit. He paused. Third, and this is important, I need to know if anyone in Langford's operation is unhappy enough to talk. Evelyn frowned. What do you mean? Langford has employees, men who've been following his orders for years. Survey tampering doesn't happen in the dark. Someone drove stakes into the ground, someone measured, someone knew what they were doing and why. He looked at her steadily. There is almost always someone in an organization like this who is uncomfortable with what they know. They just need a reason to decide it's worth talking. The room was quiet. I don't know his organization well enough to tell you who that might be, Evelyn said, but I might know someone who does. She looked at Aldridge. You've been in this county a long time. Is there anyone who's worked for Langford and left under bad terms? Aldridge thought about it. His expression went through something complicated. There was a man named Harlan Dodd, he said slowly, worked as Langford's property manager for about 4 years, left about 18 months ago. The The story I heard was there was a financial disagreement. Dodd's been working at the Glenbrook livery since. Has anyone talked to him? Evelyn said. Not that I know of. Aldridge looked at Vane. You think he'd be relevant? A property manager would know about every survey interaction on Langford's land, Vane said. He'd know who went out to which boundaries and when. He looked at Aldridge. Does he have any outstanding legal trouble? Anything Langford could use to keep him quiet? Not that I know of. Then he might be willing to talk. Vane picked up his briefcase. I'd like to see him before I leave Friday. Can you arrange a conversation? Harlan Dodd was 40 years old, thickly built, with the quiet, watchful quality of a man who'd spent years keeping other people's secrets and had developed a careful relationship with his own words as a result. He was mucking out a stall when Aldridge brought Vane and Evelyn to the livery, and he straightened up slowly when he saw them, and his eyes went over the group the way a man's eyes go over something he's been half expecting and half dreading. Clem, he said to the sheriff. Then he looked at Evelyn with the particular expression she'd seen before, the recalibration, the adjustment. You're the Mercer woman. Yes, she said. I heard about you. He looked at Vane. Who's this? Vane introduced himself. Dodd listened to the name and the Colorado Springs firm, and his expression shifted slightly. Not surprised, but alert in a new way. He leaned the mucking fork against the stall and said, What do you want to know? Tell us about the eastern boundary work on the Mercer property, Vane said. Dodd looked at the floor. A long moment, long enough that Evelyn thought he was going to decline, and she was already thinking about how to approach it differently. I didn't do it, Dodd said. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't the one who moved those stakes. But you knew about it, Vane said. Another long pause. I knew Langford sent men out to the Caldwell patent line in the spring of last year, he said. I knew it wasn't a routine check. I didn't ask specifically what they did out there because by then I'd learned that asking Langford specific questions about field operations wasn't something he welcomed. He looked up. A month later, the survey dispute letter went to Mercer. I put those two things together. Why didn't you report it? Aldridge said. Dodd looked at him with the expression of a man who finds the question both reasonable and slightly naive. Because I had a job, and because I knew what happened to people who made problems for Langford in this county. He paused. You want to know what made me leave? It wasn't the money disagreement. That's what I told people. He looked at Evelyn. It was the Haverford property. The younger one, Reed Haverford. He came to the ranch one afternoon to talk to Langford directly. Tried to negotiate. Langford had him escorted off the property and then told me to make sure the easement filing went through the county office before Haverford had time to file a counter-objection. He stopped. Reed Haverford is 26 years old. He and his brother are the third generation on that land, and Langford talked about him like he was an inconvenience to be filed away. He looked at his hands. I quit 2 weeks later. The livery was very quiet. One of the horses shifted in a stall somewhere. Outside, Glenbrook went about its midday business without knowing what was being said in the livery. Mr. Dodd? Evelyn said. Would you be willing to put what you just told us in a formal sworn statement? He looked at her. What happens to me if I do? Vane will advise you on your legal exposure, she said. But what you've described is knowledge of events, not participation in them. And you left the organization before any of this came to a legal proceeding. She held his gaze. I think you'll be all right. But more importantly, Reed Haverford is 26 years old, and he's going to lose his family's land unless enough people are willing to say what they know. Dodd looked at the floor for a long time. Then he looked at Vane. You think this actually goes somewhere? Or does Langford bury it with his Denver lawyer the way he's buried everything else? It goes to the federal land office, Vane said. Federal jurisdiction. Different set of relationships. Dodd was quiet. Then he said, All right, I'll give you a statement. They walked back from the livery in the late afternoon cold, Vane slightly ahead, Aldridge hanging back. Giving them a moment, Evelyn thought, or maybe just thinking through his own position in all of it. Wyatt was waiting outside the stage office where they'd arranged to meet. He read the situation in their faces before anyone said anything. Dodd talked, he said. He talked, Evelyn said. Wyatt looked at Vane. Does it help? It helps significantly, Vane said. A former employee with specific operational knowledge who left the organization voluntarily before the legal dispute arose is a very credible witness. He looked at both of them. I want to be honest with you about where this is. We have a strong case. But Langford will not settle easily. Prewitt will fight this at every procedural level before it ever gets to a substantive hearing. It will take time. It will create pressure on every rancher in your coalition. And at some point, Langford will make an offer that is designed to look reasonable enough to break someone off from the group. He looked at Wyatt. Your coalition has to hold. It will hold, Wyatt said. Vane looked at him with the careful, unsentimental eyes of a man who'd watched coalitions fall apart before. Promises are easy in October, he said. We'll see where things are in February. It wasn't cruel. It was just honest, which was something Evelyn had learned to appreciate about the man in the space of a single afternoon. February, Wyatt said. We'll be here. The stage back to Colorado Springs left at 4. They saw Vane off and then stood on the Glenbrook boardwalk in the October chill, watching the coach pull away. The street was quiet. May Coffee's dress shop had a lamp on in the window. The saloon across the way had started its evening business. A dog trotted past without looking at them. He's going to push back hard on Dodd's statement, Evelyn said. I know. And he's still going to try to discredit what I've done. The Holt complaint won't be the last move in that direction. I know that too. Wyatt looked at her. The light was going gray and thin in the way it did in late October at altitude, and his face in that light was tired and serious and something else she'd been noticing more lately. Present. Fully present in the way some people never were. Are you all right? He said. The question caught her slightly off guard, not because it was strange, but because of how simply he asked it, not as a courtesy, as an actual question. I'm better than I expected to be, she said. He nodded. Then he said, You know what you've built here in what, 5 weeks? 6, she said. 6 weeks. He looked down the street. I had 2 years of letters from Langford's lawyers, 2 years of losing ground in ways I couldn't name. And you came off a stage with a leather bag and read 40 pages of documents and saw what I couldn't see. He stopped, turned to her. I want you to know that I understand what that cost you, not just the work, what it cost you personally to do this, with your history with Holt. She didn't answer right away. She'd spent so much energy over 6 weeks not thinking about what any of it cost her. Compartmentalizing the Holt memories, managing the anger carefully, keeping the focus on the documents and the evidence and the next practical step. Having someone name it plainly, without pity or agenda, was harder than she'd expected. It helped, she said finally. Having something real to fight for, with someone who was worth fighting for. She said it simply, without decoration, which was the only way she could say something that true without it feeling like too much. Wyatt looked at her in the fading afternoon light. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything else for a moment, and it was the kind of silence that has a particular quality, not empty, but full, the way silence gets when the words have already been said and both people have heard them. Let's go home, he said. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. Yes, she said. Let's. They walked to where the wagon was tied, and Wyatt untied the team, and Evelyn climbed up on her own as she always did, and he climbed up beside her, and they drove out of Glenbrook in the last light of an October afternoon with more to do than they'd started with and more to hold on to than either of them had expected to find. Vane had been right about February, not about the coalition breaking. That held, though not without cost, but about the pressure. November came in hard, the way Colorado Novembers did when they meant business, and with the cold came the systematic campaign that Prewitt's firm had apparently been preparing since October. It arrived not as a single attack, but as a series of small ones, carefully spaced, each designed to do a specific kind of damage. The first was a formal letter to Sheriff Aldridge from the county solicitor's office, requesting that all documents related to the Mercer survey dispute be preserved and made available for review, pending a counterfiling by Langford's legal team challenging the methodology of Jonas Merritt's measurement. The language was procedurally correct and completely designed to tie up the evidence in a bureaucratic holding pattern while Prewitt bought time. The second was a piece in the Glenbrook Gazette, 2 paragraphs buried on the 3rd page, noting that questions had been raised about the credentials of a woman assisting in a local land dispute, referencing unspecified legal proceedings in Ohio. No names. Careful enough to avoid libel, specific enough that anyone who knew the situation understood exactly what it meant. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and set the paper down and drank her coffee in silence. It's what you predicted, Wyatt said, watching her. Predicting something doesn't make it comfortable, she said. He sat down across from her. He'd been up since 4 working the frozen water line on the South Trough, and his coat was still damp at the shoulders, and he had the look of a man who'd been through a hard morning and was prepared to go through a harder afternoon. What do we do about it? Nothing defensive, she said. That's the trap. If I respond to it, I legitimize it as something worth responding to. She looked at the paper. I do need to talk to the ranchers before they read it and start wondering. I'll ride to Putnam today. Both of us should go, she said. I need to be the one saying it, not having it said for me. They rode to Putnam's first, then to Greer's, covering both in the same cold afternoon. Evelyn did not soften what she told them. She sat in each man's kitchen and explained the Gazette piece directly. What it was, where it came from, what the Franklin County records actually showed, and what Langford was trying to accomplish by putting it in print. Putnam listened and then said, "You're telling me this yourself before I had a chance to read it. That tells me what I need to know." Tom Greer was quieter. He asked 2 careful questions about the Ohio dismissal and sat with the answers for a moment before he said, "Langford's done this before. Smeared the people who push back. It's how he operates." He looked at Evelyn steadily. Anyone who's been paying attention knows that. Whitmore, when they reached him the following day, said nothing for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "I've lived here 23 years, and I've watched Langford destroy people's reputations the same way he destroys their property lines, a little at a time, until you can't see where it started." He looked at her. "I'm not interested in what he printed in that paper." The Haverford brothers, Cal and Reed, were the ones she'd been least certain about, because they were young and the pressure of the past weeks had worn on them visibly. Reed in particular had been quiet in recent meetings, and she'd noticed the dark circles under his eyes that came from not sleeping enough for too many nights running. She told them about the Gazette piece in Cal's kitchen on a Thursday afternoon, with both brothers at the table and Cal's wife, a young woman named Iris, sitting nearby and listening without comment. When Evelyn finished, Reed Haverford looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "They came to us again," he said. "Last week, different man than before, offered us more money." Evelyn kept her face even. "How much more?" "Enough that Iris and I talked about it for 2 nights. He looked at his brother, then back at Evelyn. "But then I thought about what Dodd said, about Langford talking about me like I was something to be filed away." His jaw tightened. "I've been on this land since I was 4 years old. I'm not being filed away." He looked at Evelyn. "We didn't take the offer." She exhaled. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Reed said. "Just make sure this works." It was the most honest request anyone had made of her since she'd arrived in Colorado, and it settled in her chest with the particular weight of something she intended to carry carefully. The Franklin County records arrived the 2nd week of November, both the copy she'd requested and the one Vane had separately pursued, which had come faster as he'd predicted. The documents were unambiguous. The complaint filed by Gerald Holt in 1875 had been reviewed by the county solicitor's office and formally declined for insufficient evidence. The declination letter was signed, dated, and clear. Vane filed it immediately with the county clerk in response to Prewitt's procedural challenge, attaching a formal note that characterized the Gazette piece and the Ohio complaint as a coordinated effort to intimidate witnesses and obstruct a legitimate legal proceeding. He wrote to Evelyn separately to tell her he'd done it. His letter also contained something she hadn't anticipated. He had, through his own investigation, identified 2 additional properties in neighboring counties that showed identical patterns of Langford survey manipulation. Properties whose owners had settled with Langford 2 and 3 years ago respectively, selling out at below market prices after the legal disputes made their operations unviable. He had spoken to one of the former owners, a rancher named Aldous Crane, who now lived in Pueblo, and Crane had agreed to provide a sworn statement about what had happened to his property. She read that part of the letter twice. Then she went outside and found Wyatt splitting wood behind the barn, a task he did with the focused, rhythmic efficiency of someone who found physical work a useful place to put things he couldn't otherwise manage, and told him what Vane had found. He stopped mid-swing and looked at her. "There are others," she said, "who already settled, who lost their land." He set the axe down. "How many?" "At least 2 that Vane has confirmed, possibly more." She stood in the cold with her coat pulled close. "This goes wider than this valley, Wyatt. It's been going on longer than we knew." He looked at the split wood at his feet. She watched him process what that meant, not just for the legal case, though it was significant there, but for those families. The ranchers who'd already gone, who'd packed their lives and left land they'd spent years building because the legal pressure had become too much, because they'd had no Vane, no coalition, no Evelyn, who happened to recognize a pattern from Ohio. "Can Crane's statement be used?" he said. "Vane thinks so. It establishes a pattern of behavior across multiple jurisdictions, which strengthens the federal land office angle considerably. She paused. It also means Langford's exposure is much larger than he knows we understand. Wyatt picked up the axe again, slowly, and looked at the next log on the block. We should tell the others. Next meeting, she said. Monday. He nodded and split the log clean through. December brought the first real snow. Not the early season dusting of October, but the genuine article, 1.5 feet over 3 days that turned the valley white and silent and reduced travel to whatever your horse could manage through drifted roads. The rancher meetings moved to Putnam's place, which was more central, and they crowded into Earl's large kitchen around a table that was never quite big enough, with coffee going constantly because the cold outside was serious enough that no one was inclined to sit still without something hot in their hands. It was at the December meeting that Vane appeared in person for the second time, having ridden up from Colorado Springs in weather that suggested either dedication or stubbornness, possibly both. He looked exactly as he had in October, coat just serviceable, briefcase battered, eyes sharp, and he spread the updated case documentation on Putnam's kitchen table and went through it the way he went through everything, directly, without ceremony, expecting the people he was talking to keep up. The Crane statement, the 2 additional properties. Vane's formal filing with the Federal Land Office in Denver, submitted 3 days earlier, documenting organized fraud across at least 4 properties in 2 counties with a clear pattern of methodology. The response from the Federal Land Office acknowledging receipt and assigning a review officer. He looked around the table when he was done. Prewitt knows about the federal filing by now, he said. That changes the calculus significantly. A county dispute is manageable for Langford. Federal land fraud investigation is a different order of problem. What does that mean for the deadline on Wyatt's survey dispute? Putnam asked. The county court proceeding is effectively superseded while the federal review is active, Vane said. Langford can't proceed with the survey correction claim in county court without running directly into the federal matter. He looked at Wyatt. The immediate pressure on your property is reduced. That doesn't mean it's over. What comes next? Cal Haverford said. He makes an offer, Vane said. Probably through Prewitt, probably framed as a generous settlement that makes the whole thing go away quietly. He looked around the table, and every man in this room needs to understand right now, before it arrives, what your answer is. The kitchen was quiet except for the wind against the windows and the fire in the stove. What kind of offer? Greer said. I don't know the specifics, but I can tell you its structure. He'll offer to drop all survey disputes and legal claims in exchange for a financial settlement, probably a modest one, and a mutual agreement not to pursue further legal action. Vane's voice was flat and even. It will look like a win. It won't be. Why not? Reed Haverford said. Because it leaves everything he did without consequence. The properties he already took, Crane's the others, remain his. His operation in adjacent counties continues, and in 3 years, when the agreement's memory has faded and the coalition has dispersed, he starts again with a new set of ranchers who don't have your warning. He looked at Reed. The settlement makes you whole. It doesn't make anyone else whole. The room was quiet again. Evelyn watched the faces, the men working through it, the weight of what Vane was actually asking. Not just hold on through the legal fight. Hold on past the point where holding on was personally advantageous for the sake of something larger. She hadn't expected this to be easy, but she found herself needing to say something, and she did. I left Ohio, she said. The room looked at her. When I found out what Gerald Holt was doing, I reported it to the county, and then I left because the situation had become personally dangerous and I didn't have anyone around me willing to keep fighting it. She looked at her hands. I've thought about that more than once in the past 3 months. About the farming families in Ohio who I reported for and then left behind. I don't know what happened to them. I've wondered. She looked up. I'm not leaving this one the same way. That's a choice I've made. But I can't make it for any of you. Del Whitmore, who said things rarely and meant them when he did, spoke from the end of the table. I've been here 23 years. The man who sold me my land shook my hand and looked me in the eye and said, this valley was worth protecting. He paused. He wasn't wrong about that. He looked at Vane. Tell Prewitt whatever offer he's planning to make isn't going to be accepted without full restoration of every property right affected across every ranch in this room. Putnam's large hand came down flat on the table. That's it then. Nobody disagreed. Prewitt's offer came in January in the form of a formal letter delivered to Vane's Colorado Springs office and forwarded by courier to Glenbrook. It was, as Vane had predicted, structured to look generous. Full withdrawal of the Mercer survey dispute. Withdrawal of the Haverford easement claim. A financial payment to each affected rancher as compensation for documented disruptions. It said nothing about the properties Langford had already acquired, nothing about Crane, nothing about the other county, nothing about any future restrictions on Langford's operations. Vane drafted the counter. Evelyn sat with him in Aldridge's office on a cold January afternoon and went through it line by line because Vane had asked for her input and because she had earned the standing to give it. Their counter demand was not modest. Full restoration of every survey boundary on every affected property to its pre-dispute status, certified by an independent surveyor appointed by the Federal Land Office. Full withdrawal of every pending legal claim across all properties in both counties. Financial compensation for all documented losses. A formal admission on record that the survey stakes on the Mercer property had been relocated, and referral of the complete federal matter to the Territorial District Attorney for review of criminal charges related to survey tampering. Not a promise to pursue charges, but a referral that would remain on record. He won't accept the criminal referral, Evelyn said, reading the draft. No, Vane agreed, but it establishes that we're not simply looking for our money back. It tells him the cost of continued resistance includes personal criminal exposure, not just civil liability. And the Crane properties, the ones already settled? I've included a separate demand for a good faith meeting between Langford's representatives and the former landowners who settled under duress. What comes of that meeting is separate. We can't undo those sales through this proceeding, but putting it in the demand signals that we know about them. She looked at the draft. It was aggressive, deliberately so. Prewitt will go back to Langford with this, and Langford will either harden or fold. Yes, Vane said. Which do you think? He considered it honestly. I think he's been running this operation for a long time, and he believes himself to be untouchable in this county. The federal filing surprised him. The criminal referral demand will surprise him further. He paused. Men who believe themselves untouchable sometimes fold faster than men who've always expected a fight because they've never had to develop real tolerance for risk. And sometimes they get very dangerous. He looked at her. Be careful through this next period. She thought about Cutter, about the fence wire. I know, she said. Longford's response to the counter demand came not through Prewitt but in person, which none of them had expected. He rode to the Mercer Ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late January with 2 men behind him. Not Cutter, not the intimidation crew, but his actual ranch foreman and what looked like a personal secretary carrying a leather satchel. He came in the front way, openly at a normal hour. Wyatt was at the corral when he arrived. Evelyn was in the kitchen and saw them through the window and came out immediately because she was not going to be inside while this conversation happened. Langford was in his early 60s, she assessed as he dismounted. Lean, well-dressed for a man making a ranch call with the controlled, deliberate bearing of someone who had spent decades projecting authority. His face was angular and not unkind-looking, which was the most disorienting thing about him. He looked like a successful businessman, not a man who sent people to move survey stakes in the dark. He looked at Wyatt first, then at Evelyn, and his gaze on her was brief and evaluating and told her nothing about what he was thinking. Mercer, he said, I'd like to talk. Just talk. Wyatt looked at Evelyn. She gave him the smallest nod. Inside, Wyatt said. They left the foreman and secretary in the yard and went into the kitchen. Langford did not sit until Wyatt gestured to the chair, and he sat straight, with both hands visible on the table, which was either genuine goodwill or the practiced performance of it. Evelyn couldn't tell which yet. I'm going to be direct, Langford said. I think the situation has gotten beyond what either of us intended, and I think there's a reasonable resolution available if people are willing to find it. What did you intend? Wyatt said. Langford looked at him. I intend to build a viable land operation in this valley. I have capital and organizational capability that could benefit this region significantly. His voice was even, persuasive, the voice of a man who had sat across tables from a lot of people and won a lot of those conversations. The survey disputes were a legal strategy, not a personal attack. I understand that distinction doesn't matter much to the man whose land is affected, but... You moved the stakes, Evelyn said. He looked at her. A pause. I'm not going to discuss specific operational decisions. You moved the stakes on this property and at least one other, she said. Jonas Merritt measured the discrepancy in front of Sheriff Aldridge. Harlan Dodd has given a sworn statement describing what he observed when he worked for you. We have the Federal Land Office filing and a referral for criminal review." She said it the same way she said everything, factually, without elevation, just the information laid out in its actual shape. "I'm not interested in a conversation about what you intended. I'm interested in what you're prepared to do about what you actually did." Something moved in Langford's face. Very controlled, but real. The particular tightening of a man who is not accustomed to being addressed this way and is deciding in real time how to respond to it. He looked at her for a moment with the focused quality of someone making a reassessment. Then he looked at Wyatt. "Your wife is very direct." "She is," Wyatt said. "That's why I listened to her." Langford turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. He looked at the window. He looked at his hands. The performance of considering, or the genuine thing, she still couldn't tell. "What is it you actually want?" he said, looking at her again. "I told you," she said. "You'll have seen it in Vane's counter-demand. Full restoration of every affected boundary. Withdrawal of every legal claim. Compensation for documented losses. The criminal referral stays on record regardless of what else is settled." She held his gaze. "And a meeting, formal, documented, with the ranchers who were forced to sell to you in the past 3 years. I can't give you back land I've legally purchased. I know that. I'm not asking for it. I'm asking for the meeting." She paused. "You bought that land cheaply because you manufactured the conditions that made selling it unavoidable. What those families do with the knowledge of that and what they ask of you in that meeting is between you and them." He was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen clock marked time. Outside, one of his men said something to the other that was inaudible through the glass. "The criminal referral," he said finally, "that stays regardless." "Yes," she said. "That's not a settlement. That's surrender." "No," she said. "Surrender is what happens if this goes further and Vane puts Dodd's statement in front of a federal judge alongside Crane's and the Haverford easement filing and the Gazette piece and the Prewitt letter with the undisclosed Ohio dismissal." She kept her voice level. "That is actually surrender. This is a negotiated resolution that allows you to exit the situation with your civil standing intact." The silence stretched long enough that Wyatt moved slightly in his chair. A small, involuntary movement of a man holding himself still against the temptation to fill the quiet. Langford stood. He picked up his hat from the table. He looked at Evelyn with an expression she couldn't fully classify. Not anger, not respect exactly, something in the difficult territory between them. "I'll have Prewitt contact Vane," he said. He walked out. Wyatt and Evelyn sat in the kitchen after the sound of hooves faded, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, the January light was going thin and gray. "He's going to accept," she said. Wyatt looked at her. "You're sure? He came here himself. He didn't send Prewitt." She picked up her coffee, which had gone cold. Men like him send lawyers when they're still fighting. They come themselves when they're calculating what they can preserve. She set the cup down. "He's calculating." Prewitt contacted Vane 4 days later. The negotiation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of back-and-forth correspondence that Vane managed from Colorado Springs, consulting Evelyn by letter on each substantive point, which was an arrangement she found both practical and quietly significant, because it meant Vane treated her analysis as professional input, rather than interested party opinion. They did not get everything. The criminal referral was the hardest point, and in the end, it was structured as a conditional referral, submitted to the district attorney's office with the complete documentation, but with a notation that the civil matter had been resolved. What the district attorney did with it from there was out of everyone's hands. Vane told her honestly that it probably resulted in a fine and a formal censure rather than prosecution. She accepted that, because the alternative was extending the fight to a point where the coalition would eventually fracture under the strain, and fracturing the coalition meant individual ranchers would settle individually for less than they deserved. Half a loaf. She'd made peace with half a loaf in Ohio. She was making peace with it again here, and it sat differently this time. Heavier in some ways, lighter in others, because this time she was staying to see what came of it. The formal agreement was signed in the second week of February. Every survey boundary restored and certified. Every pending legal claim withdrawn. Compensation paid to each rancher for documented disruptions. A meeting scheduled with Aldous Crane and the one other former landowner Vane had located, to be attended by Langford's legal representative and documented by a neutral county official. Aldridge filed the complete certified survey corrections with the county land office himself, which Evelyn thought was not accidental on his part. He wanted his name on the record as the man who made sure it was done properly. Jonas Marin, when Wyatt told him the outcome, said only, "Good. My measurements were right," and went back to his woodworking. Spring came late that year, the way it sometimes did at altitude. March still locked in cold, the valley floor brown and iron hard, and then a week in April that broke everything open at once. The aspens leafed out fast, the creek ran high with snowmelt, and the north pasture that Langford had spent 2 years trying to starve of water was suddenly loud with it. Wyatt stood at the fence of the north pasture on an April morning watching the water run in the creek, and Evelyn stood beside him, and neither of them said anything for a while. The herd was moving in the far end of the pasture, unhurried, the way cattle moved when they weren't threatened, and the grass was coming in good. "Thomas is coming in June," Wyatt said. She looked at him. He'd mentioned his son in passing several times over the winter. Letters exchanged, the careful reestablishment of a relationship that had been maintained more by duty than ease, but this was the first time he'd said Thomas was actually coming. "To visit?" she said. "I wrote to him about everything, about the winter, about what happened with Langford." He paused. "About you?" He didn't look at her. His eyes were on the herd. He wrote back and asked if he could come and see the ranch. He's 16 now. She thought about a 16-year-old boy who'd left this land when he was 6, living with his aunt in Denver, growing up in a city, carrying whatever image of this place he'd held through 10 years of absence. "I'm glad," she said, and meant it. Wyatt looked at her then. The spring light was different from the winter light, warmer, less severe, and it made his face look less tired than it had been for months, though the lines were still there, and they weren't going anywhere. I was not a man who looked younger in better times. He just looked more like himself. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. "This isn't a practical question," he said. "I want to be clear about that. It's not about the ranch or the legal situation or whether you're planning to stay because the work makes sense." He stopped, and she could see him finding the words with the particular difficulty of a man who said important things rarely and therefore did not have easy language for them. "I know what you've given up by being here, a legal career you could have had in Denver or Colorado Springs from what Vane said to you, the kind of work you're actually suited for." He looked at the creek. "I know you came here for practical reasons. I know what I wrote in that letter." "Wyatt," she said. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not because you need to, because I want you to, because this..." He gestured slightly awkwardly at the pasture, the ranch, the general territory of their shared life. "This is real to me, more real than anything has been in a long time, and I don't want it to be practical." She looked at him. The creek ran. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the pasture grass, one clear note and then another. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in October carrying everything she owned in 2 bags, certain that practicality was the only safe framework for what came next. The woman who had sat at this man's kitchen table on her first night and read his documents and recognized a pattern from her worst experience and decided to fight it anyway. She thought about what fighting it had cost. The sleepless nights, the Gazette piece, the cold rides, Holt's name resurfacing in the worst possible context, the weight of other people's fear and need, and the obligation she'd taken on without being asked to. She thought about what it had given her, not the legal outcome. That mattered, but it wasn't what she was thinking about. She was thinking about the fence wire in the snow, documented in her notebook at 6 in the morning in the cold. She was thinking about Reed Haverford's face when he said, "Make sure this works." She was thinking about Whitmore at the meeting table saying, "I've been here 23 years," and meaning every syllable. She was thinking about Wyatt in the kitchen on her first night, saying, "I had 2 years of losing ground in ways I couldn't name," and the particular trust it took to say that to a stranger. She was thinking about what it meant to be somewhere that mattered, not just useful somewhere. "I'm not going to Denver," she said, "or Colorado Springs." She looked at him directly, the way she always looked at him. "I want you to know that's not a sacrifice. I want you to understand the difference." He looked at her. The difficulty of important words was still in his face, but something else was there too. Relief, she thought, and something that came after relief when it's been held off for long enough. "Evelyn," he said. "Ask me properly," she said. "You were getting there." The corner of his mouth moved, close to a smile. "Marry me," he said. "Actually marry me, not the arrangement, not the practical framework." He looked at her steadily. "I know we've been married on paper since October. That's not what I'm asking." She took a breath. Outside, the meadowlark called again. "Yes," she said. "That's what I wanted to hear." He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not with flourish, just covered it with his, the way two people touch when they've decided on something and the decision is the whole point. The rancher coalition didn't dissolve after the settlement. That surprised some people, Vane included, who'd been in enough of these situations to expect that once the immediate threat was removed, common interest would evaporate and the natural friction between neighbors would reassert itself. But the winter had done something to those men that a summer couldn't have. It had put them in each other's kitchens in the cold, had let each man see the other's fear and stubbornness and bad nights, and that kind of shared difficulty built a different quality of relationship than shared success could. Putnam proposed, at a May meeting held outdoors now that the weather allowed it, that they formalize the coalition as a Valley Ranchers Association with a small operating fund and quarterly meetings. It was not a dramatic proposal. He said it in the same tone he used for everything, firmly, without apology, as though he was pointing out a fence post that needed setting. Greer said it made sense. Whitmore said he'd contribute. The Haverford brothers said yes immediately, which surprised nobody who'd watched them through the winter. Evelyn was not at that meeting. She'd been asked and she'd declined, not because the outcome didn't matter to her, but because she understood the difference between a coalition that included her because she'd been useful and a coalition that belonged to these men because they'd built it. The second one was more durable, and more durable was what this valley needed. She heard about it from Wyatt when he came home. He told her over supper, straightforwardly, the way he told most things. "They're calling it the Garnet Valley Stockmen's Association," he said. "Good name," she said. "Putnam said you should have a seat on it if you want one." She looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said it was up to you." She thought about it. What it would mean, what it would cost in other directions, what it would enable. "Let me think about it," she said. He nodded and passed her the bread. She thought about it for 3 days, and then she said yes. Not to a seat on the association, but to something adjacent to it. Vane had contacted her in March after the settlement with a proposition. He was building a small practice focused specifically on land rights cases in the frontier counties, cases where individual landowners faced organized legal pressure from larger interests. And he needed someone with the kind of analytical eye and document knowledge she'd demonstrated over the winter. Not a partner arrangement, not yet. He was too careful for that, but a consulting arrangement. Cases she could work from the ranch, correspondence, and document analysis, with occasional travel to Colorado Springs when a case required it. She'd written back to tell him she was interested, but needed to understand what the arrangement looked like during calving season. He'd written back to say that was a completely reasonable consideration and what were her specific scheduling constraints. She wrote back with them. The arrangement was formalized in April. She was not a lawyer, she knew that, and didn't pretend otherwise. But she had something Vane described in his typically compressed way as the ability to read a fraudulent pattern faster than most lawyers I know. That was a professional skill with professional value, and she intended to treat it as one. She also told the women in the valley, Iris Haverford, Earl Putnam's wife Mabel, 3 others she'd gotten to know through the long winter, that she was willing to look at any legal correspondence that came to their households and tell them plainly what it meant. Not legal advice, just translation, just the practical service of making sure people understood what was actually being said to them before they decided how to respond. That offer cost her nothing and cost other people a great deal of their worry. It seemed like a reasonable exchange. Thomas Mercer arrived on the June stage looking like a young man who was 16 going on 30, with his father's height and his mother's eyes, which Evelyn knew from the photograph Wyatt kept in the top drawer of his desk. He stood in the Glenbrook stage office with his bag in hand and looked at his father with the careful, contained expression of a young man who loves someone, but has not been in the same room with them in years and isn't sure yet how the space between them works. Wyatt looked at his son, and something moved in his face that Evelyn looked away from, because it was too private for witnesses. She introduced herself to Thomas as plainly as she did everything. He shook her hand with good manners and looked at her with the direct, intelligent eyes she'd seen in the photograph and said, "I read what you did. About Langford. Pa wrote about it." "He told me you were coming," she said. "I'm glad you're here." They drove back to the ranch, all 3 of them, on the wagon bench, Wyatt in the middle, Thomas looking at the valley as it opened up past the town's edge with the expression of someone recognizing something they'd half believed was a memory they'd invented. "The North Creek's running good this year," Wyatt said, not quite casually. "High snow melt." Thomas looked at the creek line in the distance. "You almost lost that." "Almost," Wyatt said. "We didn't." Thomas looked at Evelyn. Because of her. Because of a lot of people, she said. Your father first. Thomas turned that over for a moment. He looked like a boy who was good at thinking and still deciding whether adults were trustworthy enough to think alongside. I've been studying law, he said, at school in Denver. Meredith, my aunt, thinks it's a practical skill. Evelyn looked at him. It is. I want to come back here when I finish. He said it the way young people said things that mattered to them, carefully, watching for the reaction, ready to pull it back if it landed wrong. If that's all right. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. This is your land too, he said. It'll be here. Thomas looked at the valley again, the aspens along the creek, the brown and green roll of the pasture land, the barn with the new siding on the north wall that had finally been replaced in March. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. There was a thing Evelyn had learned, not in the winter of fighting Langford, but over years, slowly, through her father's work and her own wrong turns. About what gave people their bearings in hard times. It wasn't certainty. Certainty was a comfort you couldn't afford to rely on, because it was always on loan and the terms were never disclosed. It wasn't safety, because safety on the frontier was a provisional thing at best, available in degrees but never complete. What gave people their bearings, she'd found, was something simpler and more stubborn than either of those. It was the daily choice to act as though the work mattered, to document the boot prints in the snow, to ride to a rancher you barely knew and tell him the truth about what was happening, to sit at a kitchen table at midnight with a candle burning down and read the documents one more time because getting it right was worth the lost sleep. The daily choice. Not a dramatic moment of commitment, not a single heroic act, but the accumulated weight of small decisions made correctly, repeated over time, in the cold and the dark and the doubt. She'd lost faith in that once, in Ohio, had let Gerald Holt make her feel that the pattern she'd recognized was a personal failing rather than a professional truth, and that the right response to a man who could damage her name was to leave rather than stand. She'd left, and she'd been right that leaving was sometimes the only survivable option, but she'd carried the cost of it, the wondering about those farming families, the question of what had happened to them, for 3 years after. She wasn't leaving this one that way. On a warm June evening, sitting on the porch of the ranch house while Wyatt and Thomas talked in the yard about the summer pasture rotation, Thomas asking good questions, Wyatt answering them with the patience of a man who'd waited a long time for this particular conversation. Evelyn listened to the creek running and the cattle moving at the pasture's far end, and the meadowlarks carrying on their inexhaustible argument with the evening. She was not a woman given to declarations, even private ones. But she found herself thinking clearly, in the particular quiet of a good evening, that she was where she was supposed to be. Not in a fatalistic sense. She didn't believe in fate, she believed in choices. But in the simpler sense that she had made choices one after another that had brought her here, and the choices looked right from this side of them. The ranch was not perfect. The north barn siding was new, but the south wall still needed attention. The books were in better order than they'd been in 4 years, but still imperfect. Daisy's leg had healed well, but she had a new habit of testing the fence at the east corner that was going to cause trouble eventually. The Garnet Valley Stockmen's Association had already had its first internal disagreement about fence maintenance standards on shared boundary lines, and Whitmore and Greer were not going to see eye to eye on that without considerable mediation. Wyatt was not perfect either. He was stubborn about asking for help with things he could barely manage alone, and he still had trouble sleeping through a full night when something was worrying him, and his bad knee was going to need attention before winter. I was also, she had found, a man of more humor than he let visible at first, dry and infrequent but real. And he had a patience that was not passivity, but something more valuable, the kind of patience that let other people say the thing they needed to say without rushing them through it. She was not perfect. She knew that too. Probably better than she knew most things. She was impatient with incompetence and sometimes with confusion. She had trouble asking for what she needed until the need had been pressing for long enough that it came out sideways. She had given her trust to the wrong person once in her life, and it had cost her years of excessive caution, which was its own kind of damage. None of that, she had decided, was the point. The point was what you did with what you had, where you were, in the time that was available. Wyatt said something to Thomas that made the boy laugh, an actual laugh, unguarded, young. Wyatt looked up toward the porch, and she met his eyes, and something passed between them that was wordless and sufficient and entirely their own. The creek ran on. The evening settled. The valley held its ground. It had been worth fighting for. She'd known that from the first night. reading the documents at the kitchen table by candlelight, recognizing a pattern she'd seen before and deciding this time to stay and see it through. She'd been right about that. She was not always right, but she had been right.